This is Kurt Cobain comparing In Utero with Nevermind, specifically how he wanted In Utero to be less commercial.
And we just wanted to make sure that it wasn't as commercial or slick sounding. And the main reason had nothing to do with wanting to alienate people or, it had nothing to do with that. We just wanted to make sure that we put out a record exactly how we want it. We wanted to put out a record that we would listen to at home. And we don't listen to very, very many bands that are produced the way Nevermind was produced. Although it is raw by comparison to most other commercial rock records, it's still, we don't listen to that kind of music. I mean, I really can't think of any other band besides R.A.M. that has that kind of production that I like, so.
That was from the interview Kurt did with MTV in December of '93. Throughout this video, I'm going to share with you multiple clips of Kurt Cobain, where he shares his thoughts on the lyrics of In Utero and how they were misunderstood, his thoughts on what Nirvana's next album and their future in general may have been like, all the controversy around In Utero, his thoughts on the sound of In Utero, the sound of Nevermind, and much more.
Nevermind was definitely an album we wanted to make. I mean, everything about that record is we have no regrets. Other than maybe the production was too slick. I mean, now that I look back on it, I don't think it's as raw as it could have been, And that's our fault. I can't blame it on anyone else. I can't blame it on Butch Vig, I mean, he recorded the record perfectly.
The producer Nirvana worked with on Nevermind was Butch Vig. Steve Albini was the producer on In Utero. I'm going to show you some of the interview I did with Steve where he discusses the making of In Utero later in this video. Steve Albini was known for his drier production sound. One of Kurt's favorite albums ever, Surfer Rosa by the Pixies, was produced by Steve Albini. The production sound of Surfer Rosa is something Kurt wanted to emulate for In Utero. He discusses that and more here.
Something actually that surprised me that I didn't know that Chris said earlier. You actually originally were thinking about Steve Albini for Nevermind.
We've been thinking about Steve Albini forever. We've been wanting to have him produce us since around Bleach, actually. I just thought it was the perfect sound for us, because when I heard Surfer Rosa, I thought, that's exactly how I want my band to sound. That's how I've always wanted our band to sound, but we've never been able to capture that sound. It was just a coincidence that he produces records like that. That's what I've heard in my head for years, that kind of snare drum sound,
I think the big, and maybe only criticism that he gets from the records he produces is that the vocals are always too low.
No, I agree. I think almost every album I've heard him produce always has the vocals too quiet. And we're a very vocal-oriented band, so it was kind of a struggle to get the vocals loud enough for him.
So there were discussions about that then?
Yeah, we're always asking him to turn the vocals up more.
Famously, Nirvana, and in particular Kurt, weren't really fans of what was supposed to be the final mix of In Utero from Steve Albini. Much more controversially, Nirvana's label hated the mixes. This created a tremendous amount of controversy, and in Steve Albini's own words, he basically went broke because the record label tried to destroy his career over how angry they were about the mixes. I'll be sharing that story in detail a bit later. For now, I'm going to share with you a 1-minute clip of Steve from one of my interviews with him, where he discusses the remixing situation.
I had a conversation with the band where I said, well, I'll listen to everything, and if I feel like I can do better, then I'm happy to try to do another round of mixes or whatever. And I had a copy of the master, and so I listened to it all, and I honestly felt like we had wrung the sponge, like we had done the absolute best that we could to that music. And so I said, yeah, if you guys want to remix stuff on your own, you have my blessing, but I feel like I can't add anything to the process. And it seemed like if that instinct was indulged, that kind of second-guessing instinct was indulged, then it would be like a collapse. It would be a string of dominoes. In that, okay, we're going to remix this song because it's a single. Okay, we're going to remix this song because it's a second single. Okay, we're going to remix the whole album. Okay, we've remixed the whole album and they're still not happy. We're going to re-record the whole album. Okay, thanks for your efforts, but, now we have to play by the book. So I felt like if I participated in that process, that it would cascade into a capitulation.
I'll show you the remainder of that clip in about 20 minutes. Essentially, long story short, another producer, Scott Litt, was brought in to polish a few of the mixes on In Utero.
Well, we listened to In Utero for about 2 months after we finished it with Albini, and listening to the album over and over again, it got a bit redundant. That drum sound is a bit overbearing after a while, and so we didn't want the entire album to sound like that, you know? We wanted something different, and Scott was available, and we love the production of REM stuff, so we just thought, let's try Scott, and it turned out great. I mean, he's one of the greatest people I've ever worked with. I think we all want to do our next record with him.
As you just heard, Kurt said he would have loved for Scott Litt to produce their next album, which would have been the 4th Nirvana record.
Now that you've put out 3 records, what would you hope happens now?
That we are able to sustain ourselves, to put out another really good record, and hopefully to progress. I really want to change our style of music. I don't want to turn into a prog rock band, but I want to do something different, really different. And I want to have enough guts to do that. And if it alienates people, that's too bad. You know, the Beatles went from, not to compare us to the Beatles, but the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and bands like that went from I Want to Hold Your Hand to Sgt. Pepper's. That was a massive progression, and I just want to experiment.
As you'll hear now, Kurt also says he'd be more open to Dave and Chris contributing songwriting-wise for the next record. Previously to this, it was basically Kurt writing everything. He also discusses how Dave Grohl came up with the main riff for the song Scentless Apprentice.
He came up with the do that part and the drum part. He came up with the drum part first, and then he came up with the guitar part. But I came up with all the other guitar things over the top of it, everything else, the lyrics and singing and everything. I'm all open for relieving myself of any kind of songwriting. That'd be great if Chris and Dave could write more songs. I don't know, since I haven't had a stomach problem and I've had a child and I'm married now, you know, I mean, I'm sure I'm a lot easier to deal with, you know. I'm not as grumpy as I used to be. I don't know, I just think our morale is at its best right now, you know. It's just, everyone just gets along. I mean, we've always gotten along. We've never really fought. I don't think we've ever gotten into a shouting argument with one another. We're pretty passive-aggressive, but now there are no bad thoughts about one another behind each other's backs at all, you know. It's like, I couldn't be happier right now.
Now, going back to Nevermind, they brought in mixer Andy Wallace to touch up the mix, which is an interesting similarity Nevermind has with In Utero in that for both albums, somebody was brought in to touch up the mix when that wasn't the original plan.
Studios are a really, really deceiving environment, you know. They just, you don't know what it's going to really sound like until you take it home and it's on a tape and you listen to it over and over again, you know. And at that point, after we attempted to mix Nevermind for like 2 weeks, we were so burnt out on it that we just didn't even care anymore. By the time we got Andy Wallace in, it was just like, oh, yeah, this is fine. You know.
Why was he brought in then? Do you think you just thought about everything too much in the way it sounded, or?
Well, we recorded the album, then we immediately started mixing, and we were just burnt out, you know. We just couldn't get it together. I don't have any explanation for it, really. It just didn't sound good. We just couldn't get it right.
Later, I'm going to share with you a clip from producer Budjovic himself, where he says an interesting story about the time Kurt completely lost his temper during the making of Nevermind. But for now, going back to In Utero. In this next clip, Kurt reflects on how several of his lyrics on various songs were heavily overanalyzed by the media. A lot of people felt that the overall theme of In Utero was Kurt expressing his frustrations towards the invasiveness of the music industry. But Kurt himself says that wasn't the case. Here, Kurt talks specifically about the song Rape Me and the lyric My Favorite Inside Source.
I've read a few reviews, and it's just, people went completely overboard, you know. My favorite inside source, you know. So the song is about rape, right? But that one line doesn't mean that song is about me. It isn't about me being raped by the media or anything. Certainly isn't, you know. But because that one line is in there, a lot of people have thought that that's what the song is about.
Here, Kurt talks about the song Serve the Servants. It's the opening song on In Utero, and the first line from the song says, Teenage angst has paid off well. Now I'm bored and old. Kurt acknowledges that that's a reference to the craziness of Nevermind, but that the rest of the song has nothing to do with the craziness of getting famous.
Yeah, well, Serve the Servants is not about, I mean, the first opening lines that say, teenage angst has paid off well, now I'm bored and old, that is certainly about, you know, my ideas about grunge rock and what I've experienced in the last few years, but the rest of the song isn't about that at all. It completely changes the subject, you know. The rest of the lyrics don't have anything to do with the band or my ideas about the band at all.
Now, you're not going to make a video for All Apologies? You're just going to go with the Unplugged?
I just haven't bothered to come up with any ideas lately. I've been on tour and I haven't been thinking of anything other than just concentrating on touring. I just don't want to bother with it right now. I don't really see the need to put out more than 1 or 2 videos for each record anymore. It's basically a waste of money because everyone knows we have a record out, you know. And if we're going to sell some more records based on the next video, then those aren't people who want to listen to our album anyhow. They bought it because of that video or that song. You know, I just want to sell albums to people who really like us and who already know about us and already like us, you know. So, I don't see any reason for it. I actually don't want to do any more videos, but I've got a few ideas for Rate Me, and we want to release it as a single, so we might do something with that.
Do you want to talk about that at all, or do you want to save that for?
We'll save it.
Was All Apologies going to be the next single anyway? Because that, I mean, of the Unplugged stuff that I've seen, that's one of the ones that I think fits the Unplugged format the best. Was that the reason for it, or were you planning on putting it out as a single anyway?
No, it was going to be the next single. I don't think it was the best performance off the Unplugged thing. That's just my opinion. I don't think it was that good, really. We've played that song a lot better before. But I see what you mean. It does fit. It could work really well acoustically.
At this point, Kurt reflects on the future of Nirvana and what he thought about Nevermind blowing up and becoming as big as it did.
Does this scare you or flatter you, or what's your reaction to the whole, when the record hit big and it was getting played all over radio?
You mean when Nevermind was out?
Yeah. You were called the most important band in the 90s and the voice of the Generation X. You flattered by that or scared by that? Or?
I'm not flattered by it, no. I mean, I've said this a million times, but and I'm kind of tired of saying it, but I mean, we're a new wave band, and that's what happened with new wave, you know. Punk rock was the revolution, you know. It was the groundbreaking thing, and then all these punk rock bands started making really tame, palatable music with punk rock fashion, and it entered the mainstream, became popular for a while, and it was a fad, you know. And that's the way I look at alternative music. You know, every once in a while I'll look at the Billboard charts and I just go, crap, just like I always have, you know. Except for R.E.M., and they totally deserve to be on Top 40, but I really can't think of any bands that are on Top 40 right now that I like, personally.
But, I mean, the punk bands that made a difference, or the new wave bands that did something, they didn't sell 9 million records worldwide.
No, they didn't. Because, yeah, I'm not saying we're a punk rock band, I'm saying we're a new wave band. But there were new wave bands that sold 9 million copies, you know, like the Knack and, you know, all kinds of stuff like that. Kaja, Goo Goo, whatever, you know.
Do you have any theory on why it happened then, or do you think it was just things were stale and it was kind of ripe for the picking?
You couldn't have said it better. It was just the right time. It was just the right album at the right time. I mean, I'm sure there was a collective consciousness, you know. People were just tired of Warrant, you know, just got old. Just like, you know, grunge music will be in a couple of years, you know, if it hasn't already. If we don't progress, if we don't change, if we don't take chances and do different things, if we put out Nevermind 3 next year, or In Utero 2, it's just going to get boring with people, you know. Pop music loses their audiences all the time. I mean, it doesn't happen very often, you know, for a pop star to become famous and stay famous for years, you know, Madonna and Michael Jackson, and that's about it.
If 5 years ago someone had said, all right, well, you're writing songs and you're in a band, you're playing guitar and singing, what do you want to do with this? What would have been your biggest hope?
To put out a record. I mean, the thought of putting out a record at that time, I mean, even just 5 years ago, to put out a record on an independent label was really, really hard for bands. It wasn't as common as it is now. Like, anybody can put out a record. Most people use their records, actual pieces of vinyl, as demos now, just to get a deal, you know. And that's one of the positive things about alternative music getting big, is that really obscure and noisy bands are being signed to major labels. And the positive thing about that is that they aren't being ripped off. You know, at least they're getting a good advance and they can live for a couple of years. You know, if they're a good band and they put out good music, then they deserve to be paid, you know, the money that they deserve. I remember going to punk rock shows and bands were always, I mean, bands from out of town were getting paid $30, you know. Some band from San Francisco comes up to Seattle and plays at the Guerrilla Gardens. Here's your $30 and, you know, kiss my feet, the promoter would say, you know. And you know, maybe that band sold out the Guerrilla Gardens and there were 400 people there, and they should have been paid what they deserve, you know, what they drew. But at the time, you know, in the late 80s, all of a sudden these independent bands, you know, just started demanding more money. We're not going to play. It was almost a revolution in a way, you know. It was really cool. I mean, I remember the first time we sold out the Vogue, and that holds like a couple hundred people here in Seattle. It's a bar. And we got paid $600. 3 years before that, we would have been lucky if we got $30.
Hey guys, I'm going to share with you now a clip from the joint interview producer Butch Vig, Dave Grohl, and Chris Novoselic did in 2011, where they reflect on the making of Nevermind. Here, Butch talks about the time Kurt completely snapped out of frustration in the studio.
There was really only one time there was mass destruction in the studio. I know exactly how it happened. These guys will remember too. We had a few attempts at recording Lithium. For whatever reason, the band kept speeding up.
What do you mean, whatever reason?
For whatever reason.
Why does a band speed up?
That's when the black cloud came over the studio. Like,
there was a momentary black cloud that came over Sound City.
My fault. My bad.
And it was probably about the...
he's a spaz. I mean, you know, it's all right.
I mean, we were halfway into the record. I think it was like maybe the 5th or 6th song that we recorded when we attempted Lithium. And after about 3 or 4 takes, something snapped in Kurt. And he launched into this song, and I didn't know what it was, and they just launched in this crazy, insane jam. And it was kind of scary. I had never seen that kind of sort of frustration and rage in Kurt. I mean, then the veins in his neck and just what was going on inside him. And that's, of course, the song that ended up being the bonus track on Nevermind. It was kind of scary to see, I have to admit. At the end of it, he smashed up his guitar, and the whole thing, luckily, because we were trying to record Lithium, was all captured on tape. And I remember sort of this pause, like, okay, I guess that's it for today, you guys. That sounded pretty cool. Okay, I didn't really know what to say. And I went out, and Kurt just walked off, and you guys were like, okay, well, I guess, yeah, we'll just go home. And then I was like, okay, well, they got to find another left-handed guitar. And I pulled Dave aside and said, do you think you could play with a click track? Click track is when you find a metronome or something, either just something to keep the steady beat all the way through the song.
Right, so for drummers that can't keep a steady beat, producers asked to play the click track. That was a big life experience.
There was a black cloud over the studio that day.
for better, for worse.
Yeah, I just sort of ignored it. It was like, okay, let's record Lithium. Everybody walked in the next case, said, Dave, here's the click track, get your headphones right. I think they did it on the first take. And by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the song was done. So it was just like, let's plow ahead.
So much uncooler to break a metronome on stage, really. Than
my God.
You know, really. You really think about it. It's just not really as cool.
That would not be cool.
Yeah, that would not be cool.
At all. I mean, honestly, the first time a drummer hears that the producer wants to work with a click track, it's like getting stabbed in the heart with a rusty fork.
Right.
You know, it's such a bummer. That was the first time I'd ever done it.
And
it turned out okay.
There's only 2 songs on Nevermind where we used to click, and one was, or a metronome. One was Lithium, because that was a bit of a struggle. And it wasn't just you. The entire band was speeding up on it, dude. I got your back here.
Bass player was
probably speeding up too.
Butch.
All of the songs on Nevermind, except for Lithium and Something in the Way, were done just in the room live, just feel. And they sound amazing. I mean, they really do. And you can hear it in those performances. I didn't really have to do a lot of editing. Sometimes in the studio you have to get a razor blade out and chop up drums and go in and punch in bass notes and things. And we did very minimal amount of that in the record. It really came down to performance. On Nevermind, it's really about the performances. We captured the essence of what that band is. They were so focused when they came in, and that's one of the things that, to me, makes that record sound so good now, is that, and still relevant, is that the performances are exciting. I mean, they sound real.
If you want to hear more of that interview, skip ahead to the last 25 minutes of this video. I've included it all there. Butch, Dave, and Chris share many rare behind-the-scenes stories about the making of Nevermind during this Sirius XM interview. Now, the following is a quote from Kurt where he talks about how he knew there was something wrong with the In Utero mix, but he couldn't figure out exactly what was wrong. I believe he said this in 1993. Quote,
"The first time I played In Utero at home, I knew there was something wrong. The whole first week I wasn't really interested in listening to it all, and that usually doesn't happen. I got no emotion from it. I was just numb. So for 3 weeks, Chris, Dave, and I listened to the record every night trying to figure out what was wrong. I couldn't really say much to anyone because at the time, I wasn't sure what I wanted to change on the album. We didn't know what was wrong. So I wasn't looking forward to hearing it when usually I'll listen to what we just recorded a lot to scrutinize it. I could not put my finger on it at all. I couldn't tell what was wrong. We finally came to the conclusion that the vocals weren't loud enough, and the bass was totally inaudible. We couldn't hear any notes that Chris was playing at all. I think there were a few songs on In Utero that could have been cleaned up a bit more. Definitely Pennyroyal Tea. That was not recorded right. That should have been recorded like Nevermind because I know it's a strong song, a hit single. You hit and miss. It's a really weird thing about this record. I've never been more confused in my life, but at the same time, I've never been more satisfied with what we've done. We just hadn't spent enough time on the mixes. The mixing we did with Steve Albini was on the average of 1 an hour. It was so fast, it was ridiculous. We haven't recorded that way for a long time. That's not the way we want to mix anymore. It's not a matter of money because we've spent a lot of money and the actual recording of the album cost $17,000, which is nothing for a major label release. It just took a long time to figure out exactly what was wrong. We decided to take a chance on remixing 2 of our favorite songs to make sure the vocals would be loud enough. The rest of them we thought we'd take the chance of improving them during the mastering. Mastering is an amazing thing. You can really change a lot of things. You can take the vocals completely out or turn them up 4 or 5 decibels. That took care of it.
end quote. For his part, Steve Albini has a bit of a different recollection. As a matter of fact, in this quote, Steve says the remix version of In Utero sounds screwed up to him, and that he was always apprehensive about the idea of remixing it. Quote,
Kurt asked me about doing some remixes. I said, all right, which songs are you talking about remixing? Kurt named a few specifics, but then he said, but really we'd like to redo it all. He wanted to remix everything. Chris didn't think his bass guitar was well defined enough. There were certain songs where Kurt didn't think the vocals came out enough, but it was all subtleties. That was more evidence to me of this climate of fear he developed. They had made a great record, but the record label and all the other harpies in their life had managed to convince them that they had something to doubt. And I think Kurt was trying to articulate his position, which was that he felt uncomfortable with it. He wanted to make himself confident. He wanted to make a record that he could slam down on the table and say, listen, I know this is good, and I know your concerns about it are meaningless, so go with it. And I don't think that he felt that. He wanted to redo stuff in the hopes of getting there. My problem was that I feared a slippery slope. I called back Kurt and said, listen, if you guys want to remix some stuff, you have my blessing. The subtleties in the recording that you were talking about, you can't change some of these things without fundamentally changing the presentation of the music. I said that I just don't feel like I could do any better. From a business standpoint, that was probably a bad idea because I could have squeezed more money out of them. From a personal standpoint, I think I may not have sat well with the band that I wasn't willing to just say, yeah, I'll do it all again. But I know it was the right thing to say. I had a copy of the record before it was mastered. I knew that if it was manipulated in any way beyond that point, some of that greatness was going to evaporate, and I just didn't want to be party to it. The dynamic range was narrowed. The stereo width was narrowed. There was a lot of mid-range EQ boost added, and the overall sound quality was softened. And the bass response was compromised to make it sound more consistent on radio and home speakers. But the way that I would describe it in non-technical terms is that they screwed it up. The end result, the record in the stores, doesn't sound all that much like the record that was made. Yes, you can screw something up by trying too hard to make it good, by going through too many steps. If you're making a cake and you want it to be perfect, and you keep putting in these little filigrees and touches of spices and ingredients, before long you have all this stuff affecting itself. You want it to make a great cake, but by continually twiddling with it, you ended up taking away some of its inherent quality.
End quote.
I said, look, if you guys want to remix stuff on your own, you have my blessing. It's not my record, it's your record. And in the end, they did. They re-recorded some of the vocals backing vocals on one song, and they remixed a couple of songs. And the album that was released, ultimately, was the recordings that we did, that is, the band and I did. The bulk of the record were the original mixes that they did that were originally rejected. There were 2 or 3 songs, I forget, that were remixed and subsequently released as singles and included on the album. But the main thrust of that description is that the record that ended up in the stores is the record the band wanted people to hear. There was a slight difference between that record and the record that they ended up with at the end of the sessions, but that was their decision, and they decided that they wanted to release that album in that way. It's their record. They get to do that. Whatever like minor bruise to my ego there is that they wanted to remix some stuff is completely irrelevant to the fact that that band remained in control of that record, and they released a record that they were proud of, right? That's the end of the story as far as I'm concerned. I was working for them. I was an employee, right? So, like, the guy that installs the toilet in your house doesn't get to tell you how to paint it, right? So that's my relationship with that band. And so I have no beef with the band. They were under extraordinary pressure. Like, everyone around them was telling them that they had to play ball. Every single person in their orbit. All of their management people immediately wanted to capitulate because they were afraid for their careers. All of the people that worked with them and in proximity to them at the record label, they were all afraid of their careers. Everyone at the record label was afraid that they were going to have a bad quarter if the Nirvana record wasn't a smash hit. So up the entire corporate ladder, everyone was terrified of this band making their own decisions. And in the end, it's just, the record is appreciated by their audience, and that's really all that matters. The band made a record that they liked, that they were proud of, and their audience, the people with whom they had a direct relationship, appreciated that record, and that's the end of the story.
You're kidding me, right? This is the follow-up to Nevermind? That's what Dave Grohl said was the reaction of Nirvana's record label when they first heard the recordings for In Utero. Nirvana's label, DGC, absolutely hated In Utero initially, so much so that the label aggressively went after the producer of the album, Steve Albini. This is what Steve told me himself during one of my interviews with him. He told me that he essentially went bankrupt because of the fallout from that album. It's a very intense story, and later in this video I'll be sharing with you exactly what Steve said. But first, let's go over exactly what happened with In Utero and why Nirvana's label had such a bad reaction. It all starts with Nirvana's previous album, Nevermind. I know Kurt had a very determined point of view about Nevermind after it was successful. It was important to him to make a record that he didn't feel was quite so commercial. Kurt had a really determined view about what he wanted In Utero to be. That was from Mark Cates, one of the people from Nirvana's label who worked with the band. Initially, Nevermind was not expected to be a big hit. But as of this recording, Nevermind has sold over 30 million copies worldwide, let alone the billions of streams the songs from Nevermind have online. But initially, Nirvana's label only made 46,000 copies of the album. They had zero expectation this was going to be a huge commercial success. The album was released on September 24th, 1991. A few months later, by January 11th of 92, it had become the #1 album on the US Billboard charts, replacing Michael Jackson's album Dangerous. By this point, Nevermind was selling about 300,000 copies a week. Needless to say, the album was massive. Therefore, Nirvana's record label wanted the band to make a second album that sounded like Nevermind. But Nirvana did the opposite. Instead of making Nevermind Part 2, they made In Utero. a far less commercial, less radio-friendly album. Nirvana did not try to capitalize as much as they could have financially on their fame. Kurt Cobain's struggle with fame is well documented. During my interview with Bruce Pavitt, co-founder of Nirvana's original record label Sub Pop, he spoke about how Kurt did want to be famous, but that he was very conflicted about it, partly because it went against his punk ideology. It's not very punk to be a mainstream huge commercial star. I'll show you the clip with Bruce Pavitt a bit later. Bottom line with In Utero, Kurt was essentially rejecting his mainstream stardom, at least to an extent. Even though In Utero was still a success, it likely would have been bigger and more mainstream if the album was a bit more polished and more commercially friendly like Nevermind was. And that is the key issue for the record label. Nirvana's label wanted something the mainstream would fully embrace. And thus, when they first heard the In Utero recordings, they were very unhappy and wanted Nirvana to redo the entire album. Nirvana didn't redo the album, but they did remix a few of the songs before the album was released. To be clear, it wasn't just Nirvana's label who weren't the happiest with In Utero. Walmart, for instance, wouldn't include In Utero on their shelves because of the song Rape Me. Walmart would not include the album on their shelves unless the word rape was removed from the back cover of the album. And so there are some pressings of In Utero where instead of Rape Me on the back cover, it says Waif Me. Yes, actually. But even on these Waif Me pressings, the recording still says Rape Me. There's no actual version of the song where Kurt says Waif Me. In 2013, a former employee at the sales department for DGC Records named Ray Farrell told the following to Billboard magazine about why exactly Rape Me was changed to Waif Me. Quote, "We were told that the largest chain department stores in America would not sell In Utero with Rape Me listed on the back cover. Thus, Rape Me would have to be changed in order for In Utero to be available in these stores. DGC gave Nirvana the option for the album to be sold in these stores or not. In many parts of the country, these were the only stores where you could buy CDs. Kids shopped there with their families. And so, the choice Kurt made was that he would rather reach kids in the stores than not be there at all. Thus, he agreed to change the song title, but it had to be done quickly. Kurt said, 'Why don't you just change Rape Me to Sexually Assault Me?' I said, 'The problem is that the title is too long, it won't fit on the artwork design.' So I asked him to come up with a 4-letter word to substitute the word rape. Then Kurt said, 'I'll tell you what, just call it Waif Me.' And that's how the substitute was made and how In Utero went into the big chain stores." End quote. Regarding the negative reaction from the record label towards In Utero initially, Ray Farrell said the following, quote, "There was a rumor within DGC before the album was completely turned in that the album may not be acceptable. I remember getting a cassette directly from Kurt. He said to me, 'I don't know how long it will take for all the right people in the company to hear this, so I made this cassette for you, so you could hear it early.' I thought maybe Kurt was doing some preemptive situation handling, so he could rally the people that would be sympathetic towards In Utero. But any record company is certainly thinking about how to match or increase sales in a situation like what they had with Nevermind. In Utero was a development from Nevermind and showed where Nirvana was going musically had they stayed together." End quote. Whatever Nirvana put out, their follow-up album to Nevermind was essentially guaranteed to succeed. The only question was, how much would it succeed? How big of a commercial hit would it be? Reflecting on this, DGC's former head of marketing, Robert Smith, once said the following to Billboard, quote, "We put out the follow-up album to Nevermind, In Utero by Nirvana, the most significant band of the 90s outside of Guns N' Roses, who DGC also had on its roster. By the time In Utero came out, Nirvana was universally known and had access on every level from press, TV, retail, and touring. Everything they did, people paid attention to. So it took no extraordinary effort on the marketing side to set up or put out In Utero. I don't recall we did anything really special." End quote. This is exactly why Nirvana's label was unsatisfied with In Utero. Nirvana was in a position where anything they put out would become massive. Yet, instead of fully capitalizing on this from a financial point of view by putting out an album as commercially viable as Nevermind, they put out In Utero. As of this posting, In Utero has sold about 15 million copies worldwide, a huge figure, but it's only half of the roughly 30 million Nevermind has sold. In all likelihood, In Utero would have sold more copies if it was more commercially friendly like Nevermind. As mentioned earlier, the person who took the biggest hit from all the controversy around In Utero was producer Steve Albini. In a few minutes, I'm going to share with you a couple of articles which compare In Utero with Nevermind and the situation around the album. But first, I want you to hear it directly from Steve himself. This is a clip from one of my interviews with Steve where he discusses how bad things got with Nirvana's label.
There was an active attempt to wreck my career on the part of the people associated with that record label.
When did you first realize that this was happening, that this was starting to develop these problems?
Well, the first inkling was when the band called me and said, yeah, the record label and the management hate the record. They want us to redo it all. And I was like, yeah, I kind of saw that one coming. It was a very dark time for me. The year after I did that record, I went completely broke. There was an aggressive campaign to discredit me or embarrass me or try to cause me harm, which was effective in that I lost a lot of business in the intervening year or so. But I don't personalize that toward the band. I feel like the band were the one party in all of this who were not taking shots at me, you know?
Yeah.
They didn't personalize their complaints. I'm gratified by the fact that they didn't scapegoat me to the extent, you know, that their record label and their management did. It was a surreal experience to have this big corporation have invested a lot of money and their sort of publicity capital in a record by the biggest band in the world and have those very selfsame people shit talking me to music journalists and other people in the music business and actively trying to cause me harm. That was a very surreal experience for them to be shitting on this record that was obviously very important to them. From a business standpoint, it was going to be a huge record, and I just didn't get why they were shitting on the record. And then as a secondary effect, shitting on me. I just didn't get it, and it was an unpleasant period for me. The year after making that record, I saw a big drop-off in my normal clientele. Like the smaller bands that I was working with, the independent bands, a lot of them were suspicious of me now because I'd worked on this big hit record, and that made them suspicious of me and my motives. Like, there was a kind of a normal career trajectory where somebody would start out in the underground and they would start to get noticed, and then they would become sort of a mainstream player and then unavailable to anybody who wasn't a big name.
Yeah.
Something similar to that had happened with Butch Vig, like who was a hero in the underground and in the punk scene. Then his name was associated with Nirvana, and suddenly none of the bands that were his bread and butter in the years prior, none of them could get him to answer a phone call. And that's just a result of him moving into a sort of a professional tier where those bands didn't have access, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a suspicion of me that was sort of expected to happen with me, that I would now be unavailable to all of my normal clientele. So that normal clientele disappeared or dropped off dramatically. And then the sort of mainstream or major label artists were being actively discouraged from working with me. And I know this because I have friends who were in the process of making records in the year or two after that, who were told explicitly by their handlers that they were not allowed to work with me. They could work with basically anybody else. They just weren't allowed to work with me.
I'll include the remainder of that interview at the end of this video alongside the clip of Bruce Pavitt discussing Kurt's relationship with Fame. But first, I want to read to you a few articles which elaborate on the differences between Nevermind and In Utero, why Kurt took the album in a more aggressive direction, the negative reaction from the record label, and much more. The first article is from joe.co.uk by author Rich Cooper. Quote,
Nirvana followed Nevermind in 1991 with 93's In Utero. People talk about the quote-unquote difficult third album. The idea that bands use up all their good ideas on their first two records and don't quite manage a hat trick. And, on top of that, most bands, unlike Nirvana, don't have to record a follow-up album to a generational defining record like Nevermind. Now that Nirvana were megastars, they could have forged further into the mainstream, churned out another bag of hits that the radio stations would lap up and watch the money roll in. Instead, however, Nirvana rallied against their commercial success. They spat at it. They made In Utero. It doesn't take much to understand the difference between Nevermind and In Utero. These are two drastically different albums. Nevermind sounds huge, sky-high guitar, stadium drums, in-your-face vocals with Kurt meticulously crafting melodies and some of rock's most well-known riffs. Nevermind is basically as close to perfect as rock music gets. In Utero is none of these things. If Nevermind is glass, In Utero is rust and nails. The opening dissonance of Serve the Servants, a kind of A Hard Day's Night for Gen X, signals that this is not going to be Nevermind Part 2. The songs on In Utero are deliberately jarring and unwelcoming. However, although the sound of In Utero was intended to agitate, the quality of the songwriting shines through. A song like All Apologies showcases Cobain's dedication to melody and composition. Rape Me could have been a radio smash if it wasn't called Rape Me. But then it wouldn't be Rape Me, so what would be the point? On the other hand, you have songs like Tourette's, Milk It, and Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter that are unrestrained aggression. And yet, for all their willful rejection of mainstream tastes, these songs are enjoyable to listen to because they came from Kurt Cobain. As an artist, Kurt was constantly worried about selling out. Nirvana had signed to a major label and released one of the biggest rock albums of the decade. And so when it came to In Utero, Kurt pushed back against the success of Nevermind. In Utero was meant to be the antithesis of Nevermind. And in doing so, Nirvana made a statement, a declaration that they were not for sale. But even more than that, they made a really good album.
End quote. The following is from Far Out magazine by author Tim Kaufman regarding Nirvana's record label. Quote,
"No one in Nirvana was equipped for the baggage that came with the release of Nevermind. After the monumental success of Teen Spirit, Kurt grew to hate the song that made him a star, saying it was nothing but a cheap pop song in his eyes. For the follow-up to Nevermind, Kurt had his mind focused on something more raw, and producer Steve Albini would be the one to give him the results he wanted. Nirvana's label, however, DGC Records, wasn't happy about In Utero. Chaotic songs like Serve the Servants and Very Ape were the polar opposite of what the label had wanted. They were hoping essentially for Nevermind Part 2, something more polished, more radio-friendly than In Utero. But Kurt didn't feel comfortable returning to the same formula he had used on Nevermind. Steve Albini was known for his minimal approach to production, and thus, reflecting on the first time they handed the recordings for In Utero to their label, Dave Grohl remembered everyone being mortified. In Dave's words, this was their reaction. "We came back from recording In Utero. The first thing the record company said to us was, 'You're kidding me, right? This is the follow-up to Nevermind?'" With In Utero, Nirvana created a deliberately harsh album, as if it was a reaction to the massive success of Nevermind. In any case, it was Steve Albini, not the band, who got the brunt of the hatred from the record label. Steve Albini once said the following, "I wasn't there when the band was having their discussions with the record label. All I know is we made a record, everyone was happy with it, but a few weeks later I hear it's unreleasable and it's all gotta be redone." Again, that was from Steve Albini. Now, while the band refused to roll over and do everything from the beginning, they did decide to bring in mixer Scott Litt to provide touch-ups on the album's singles. But regardless, despite the pushback from the label and a handful of fans, Kurt wasn't willing to reel things back, later stating in his biography, Come As You Are, "Of course they want another Nevermind, but I'd rather die than do that. This album, In Utero, is exactly the kind of record I would buy as a fan, that I would enjoy owning."
End quote. Now, I want to take a look at the In Utero versus Nevermind debate and which album is ultimately quote-unquote better. I'll be looking at perspectives from both sides, those who say Nevermind is better and those who say In Utero. Nevermind is the more mainstream album, and so by extension, more casual fans of Nirvana prefer Nevermind over In Utero. But is that a bad thing? Depending on who you ask, you'll get a different answer. Some people argue it proves Nevermind is the better album, because it's so good it appeals to a wider audience. Others suggest Nevermind's mass consumerism proves it doesn't have the artistic value of In Utero. Kurt Cobain himself eventually rejected the Nevermind sound and deliberately wanted to make the more aggressive In Utero. Doesn't that prove In Utero is artistically superior? That it's a more honest reflection of Kurt's creativity? Not necessarily. First of all, if aggression is what defines a good Nirvana album, then by that definition, the best Nirvana album would have to be Bleach. At least in my opinion, Bleach is Nirvana's most aggressive record. Jack Endino is the producer from Bleach, and interestingly, he also produced demos for In Utero before Nirvana started working with producer Steve Albini. As mentioned earlier, I'll be including my Steve Albini In Utero interview later in this video. After the Albini interview, I will also include a clip from one of my interviews with Jack and Dino where he discusses the making of the In Utero demos. Now, going back to the Nevermind verse In Utero debate, writer Jeffrey Thiessen makes an interesting argument. He argues that Kurt was motivated by an agenda during In Utero. That agenda, of course, was to make a more aggressive album than Nevermind. Whereas during the making of Nevermind, there was no agenda other than to make a great album. Therefore, from this perspective, one could argue that the songs on Nevermind are a more pure reflection of Kurt's creativity, rather than In Utero, which had an agenda. He argues that Nevermind is the better album, but that its massive popularity causes some quote-unquote real Nirvana fans to downplay the record. He said the following for PopMatters.com, quote, "A funny thing has happened to me the last few years. I started believing Nirvana's In Utero was a better album than Nevermind. This conclusion was beat into my brain through brutish peer pressure. Peer pressure so effective, I didn't even know it was happening until it was too late. You have no idea how many people would say this stuff to me as though it was some obvious truth everyone now accepts. Things like, I still listen to Nevermind here and there, but In Utero pretty much kills it in every major way. Or, there are at least 3 tracks on In Utero that are better than Teen Spirit. Or, Nevermind sucks. It's total pop garbage. In Utero, however, is a masterpiece. You get the idea. Just a bunch of ridiculous nonsense. The thing is, though, that nonsense started seeping into my subconscious, and I found myself spouting out similar sentiments. For the longest time, I'd auto-choose the sonic boom of Scentless Apprentice over any of the iconic seminal tunes of Nevermind. To be clear, it's not embarrassing that I chose In Utero for so long, but what is embarrassing is how I reached that conclusion. I'm not saying you can't make the argument that In Utero is a better album. Of course you can, and it's not that difficult. But I guess the question I'm asking is, why does In Utero seem to have the consensus? It's a bit shocking to me how In Utero seems to have come out the overall knee-jerk victor when the two albums are discussed. Nevermind has Teen Spirit on it. Teen Spirit is masterful, and in my opinion, nothing on In Utero can touch it. I don't care how many times MTV played the song and how sick of it you are. It's just unmatched by anything in the 90s. That's my star witness right there. Kurt Cobain used to brag that there are no teen spirits on In Utero. But why is that a good thing? Teen Spirit gave millions of disillusioned kids a voice. Yes, there's certainly a dark side associated with fame and mainstream popularity, but in my opinion, that's the side Cobain focused on the most. It seems to me that when he closed his eyes and thought about his legacy, he didn't really see a kid rocking out in his room to the opening chords of Teen Spirit. He mostly saw the frat boys using Nevermind as a soundtrack to their date rape parties. In my opinion, it was through this that the seeds of In Utero were planted, and to me that makes the recording process of Nevermind much more pure and untainted. There was no agenda with Nevermind, whereas with In Utero, it was trying to burn everything down. It had a plan, and that plan was destruction. And what a battering ram of an album it was. From what I've read, I know that Kurt was happier with it than Nevermind. It's got that barbed wire guitar attack that producer Steve Albini was sort of famous for. A lot of screaming, and was basically way more inaccessible than Nevermind. Kurt always felt an intense connection to the punk community, and he did everything he could to strengthen this connection, which became kind of difficult when you have an album like Nevermind selling millions of copies and becoming a mainstream staple. I understand why Kurt's punk ideology was important to him. That's the ideology he grew up admiring on a very concentrated level. And yes, while I'll concede that Kurt is punk to a large extent, there's also a big chunk of him that yearned and excelled at writing great poppier songs. In Utero was railing against the gift that made him special to millions, and for me, that's the primary reason it's a fantastic betrayal of his own artistic impulses. However, Kurt couldn't completely avoid those poppy impulses. It seems simplistic to classify In Utero as consisting of noise outbursts and pop-heavy anthems, but that's what it is in my opinion. Nevermind saw him channel those impulses into a working punk aesthetic, and to me that's where the brilliance lied with Nirvana's breakthrough smash record. Interestingly, that's also the source of an inherent disconnect in their follow-up album. At some point, it felt that Nevermind was so overplayed by everyone in North America that In Utero became a welcome difference. I understand that.
It became cool to like the noisy Nirvana record, and fairly uncool to prefer its catchy predecessor. If you like Nevermind, you're part of the problem, right? Well, here are 2 points to consider. 1. Kurt was a Beatles fan. This is well documented. He loved writing a good pop song. Yes, he loved the punk MO, but he always had something else churning inside of him, whether he wanted to admit it or not. And 2, Nevermind, for the most part, in my opinion, had the better songs than In Utero. They aren't as forceful, but they're just superior. Better songs equals a better album. I say that without fear of contradiction. Sure, there are some masterpieces on In Utero, but the rest can't match any of Nevermind's strongest material, which is basically the whole album. Nevermind also wasn't nearly as calculated either, and to me, that makes it more punk than anything on In Utero. I know, I get it, it's more fun to choose In Utero. It's more fun to talk about. But do you know why that is? It's because Nevermind was so amazing, and we talked about that album so much, there's nothing left to say. In Utero didn't enter our hearts in the same way as Nevermind. It carved its way in. It entered on its own terms, and those terms didn't even really bring out the best from Kurt Cobain.
End quote. The following is an interesting piece from livejournal.com by a user named Josh the Vegan, where he discusses why In Utero is the better album in his opinion. Quote,
If I were to claim that In Utero is a better album than Nevermind, that would just be an opinion which many people would disagree with. But if I were to claim that In Utero holds a bigger cultural significance than Nevermind, that would just be flat out untrue. I really like Nevermind. I do. But that doesn't change the fact that In Utero is the Nirvana album I turn to far more often. Now, 2011 is the 20-year anniversary of the release of Nevermind, and as such, it's on a lot of people's minds. I came across a copy of Spin magazine, and this particular issue was their Nevermind tribute. The way they covered the album was to interview tons of people who were either contemporaries with Nirvana, worked in the music business at the time, or are currently popular and list Nirvana as one of their influences. It was really well put together, but there was one quote which really got under my skin. As I recall, it was from some singer from some band I never heard of and probably will never listen to. I forgot the exact quote, and I don't have the patience to dig around Spin's website to find it, but the gist of it was, Nevermind is the best Nirvana album, and anyone who says In Utero is better is just being a jerk. I like In Utero better. Screw this guy. That's how I felt after reading that quote, and it's because of this knucklehead I feel the need to defend my preference for Nirvana's totally overshadowed third and final album. There's nothing wrong with radio-friendly music. In fact, there's quite a bit of it I like. But the music that I most often lean towards, though, is the stuff that commercial radio wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. The artists who take risks and make music without concern for radio play. I'm not saying that Cobain set out to write a smash hit album when he was penning the songs that would become Nevermind. He was simply going through a writing period where he was influenced by the Pixies and it just so happened to become a smash. He had no idea it would happen. In Utero, on the other hand, is almost actively un-radio friendly. Take the song Scentless Apprentice, for example. That song is an absolute masterpiece of atonality, screaming, and noise. There isn't a chance mainstream stations would ever play it, and I love the song even more because of that. A lot of the songs on In Utero, Scentless Apprentice, Very Ape, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, etc., are based around guitar riffs that aren't very melodic and depend more on their rhythmic merit. When you have a drummer as impressive as Dave Grohl, this is a fantastic route to take. All three of the songs I mentioned revolve largely around simple rhythms that Dave Grohl pounds out like a jackhammer destroying asphalt. It's practically impossible to listen to those songs in your car without pounding your steering wheel. And I also think the production on In Utero sounds better than Nevermind. When Butch Vig was tapped to produce Nevermind, he was a relatively unknown producer. He had worked on a good number of albums, but aside from the Smashing Pumpkins debut Gish, none of Butch Vig's previous albums really attracted much national attention. After Nevermind, he went on to become a sought-after producer, but at the time he wasn't that well known. When Nirvana went back to the studio to work on In Utero, however, they brought along a producer who was already taken very seriously at the time, especially by punk artists, Steve Albini. Albini is known for his bass-heavy, grimy basement sound that he brings to nearly every project he's worked on, and In Utero is no different. The mix on this album sounds like you are buried deep inside of Chris Novoselic's bass cabinet, which happens to be placed in a barren concrete room. The low end is front and center, and the treble is reverby and slightly low in the mix. This translates orally to what it's like seeing a show in a small club, which I'm very sure was the intention of both Albini and the band. It's different than Nevermind. Nevermind does also have great production work. It has a fuzzy underground approach to its pop sheen. It's one of the reasons people love it. But it's not anywhere as abrasive as In Utero. I could go on for pages and pages about how In Utero deserves more respect than it gets, but I think I'll leave you with this final thought. If you still have any question as to the greatness of In Utero, simply turn the album on for the last 3 tracks, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, Tourette's, and All Apologies. That should clear it all up for you.
End quote. The following article also debates that In Utero is the better album. This is from author Aaron Starkey for FarOutMagazine.com. Quote,
in the story of Nirvana, Nevermind typically hogs the attention. After all, this is the album that made Kurt Cobain and the band cultural icons. However, there's also a solid argument that their follow-up album, In Utero, is better. That's the camp I find myself in. Darker, more robust, and at points far more emotionally piercing than Nevermind, this Steve Albini-produced masterclass sees the band largely return to their abrasive roots, semi-reminiscent of their debut album, Bleach. Concurrently, Kurt Cobain conceived lyrics that heavily allude to the present complexity of his personal life and struggles, despite claiming it is a quote-unquote very impersonal body of work. The anger and confusion of Nevermind remains on In Utero. The sentiments are just taken to the more extreme levels that the group has always teased. There's emotional violence on In Utero, all served up with literary depth. Take track 2, Scentless Apprentice, for example. Whether it be the ominous thunder of Dave Grohl's drums, the off-kilter menace of Cobain's guitar, or his intense screams towards the end, you'd likely end up interred if you listen to this piece repeatedly. Such is the scope of the darkness contained in the song and on In Utero as a whole. Now, while Scentless Apprentice is more hectic than everything on Nevermind combined, it's not the only piece demonstrating the increasingly murky territory the band found themselves in on In Utero. But for all the psychological terror that colors the album, the game-changing formula of Nirvana is still very much present, the quiet, loud, quiet dynamics. Kurt Cobain's proclivity for pop-oriented melodies are flawless, augmented by the noisy production of Steve Albini on In Utero. This helped Nirvana tap into the area they had always wanted, fusing the thorny sounds of the underground with the sounds of their heroes like the Beatles more tightly than ever before. In many ways, Albini helped elicit Nirvana's most refined version. To achieve this, the group stayed in a house on the grounds of Pachyderm Studios in Minnesota, USA. Reflecting on its isolation, Chris Novoselic once said the following: "There was snow outside, we couldn't go anywhere, we just worked. Only Nirvana, Steve Albini, and technician Bob Weston were present for most of the sessions. Nirvana made it clear to their label DGC and their management company Gold Mountain that they wanted no intrusion." In the best example of why Steve Albini was the perfect man for the job, he instituted a policy of ignoring everyone but the band. There's no wonder then that In Utero sounds like the band in a flow state. Duly, it is the best reflection of their artistic capabilities. While there are angrier cuts like Milk It, Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, Very Ape, and Rape Me, there's also the slow acoustic and orchestral number Dumb, a classic Nirvana track in its self-effacing lyrics and moving music. Essentially, all the bases are covered on In Utero. For me personally, the closing track on the album, All Apologies, is the pinnacle. It's one of the greatest closing tracks in history. It's a perfect, if not profoundly depressing, means of bringing the curtain down on one of the most significant acts of all time. Although the unplugged version of All Apologies is the one that most people remember, there's something about the electric version on In Utero that sticks out. Kurt told Rolling Stone's David Frick in 1993 that All Apologies and Dumb represent the lighter, more dynamic side of the group. All in all is all we are, Kurt repeats as All Apologies winds down to its close. It's epitaph-like. A flawless way to bow out, Nirvana's In Utero is one of the greatest albums ever made and will remain so forever. End quote.
Now, I want to share with you a clip from my interview with Bruce Pavitt, co-founder of Nirvana's original record label Sub Pop, where he discusses how Kurt Cobain wanted to be famous, but that he also struggled with fame, and it was this struggle within Kurt that directed him towards making a more aggressive album like In Utero. Following Bruce Pavitt, I'll be showing you the remainder of my In Utero interview with Steve Albini, where he discusses more about the record label situation, as well as the making of the album itself artistically. the unique things Kurt would do when he was recording songs, funny stories about the band, and much more. And then, after Steve Albini, I'll be showing you a clip from one of my interviews with Jack and Dino where he talks about the In Utero demos. But first, here's Bruce Pavitt. So when it comes to Kurt, one of the things that people debate about sometimes is, did Kurt want to become famous or did he not want to become famous? In your honest opinion, what do you think?
He totally wanted to be famous, but he also was very conflicted because he very much identified with punk ideals. And so that's what made the whole story so fascinating, is that conflict. And Sub Pop was kind of the same way. You had the sub, which was very underground, and pop, which is the implication that underground music could be popular. For Kurt to circle back and go to Steve Albini, that's a bold gesture. Steve's a good engineer, he's a good producer, but he's not super commercial. That was Nirvana's way of saying, we're gonna go with a slightly more abrasive approach. This time, rape me. I dare you to play that on radio. They had a punk side, so you'd see that conflict, and it was pretty fascinating. My biz partner John Poneman has gone on record as saying, like, he had some talks with Kurt, and I didn't know this at the time, but he recently said, yeah, I had talks with Kurt, and he was like, we should be selling millions of records, and he was very confident in Nirvana's potential to sell, and it's the main reason he left Sub Pop, that even though he sold 40,000 copies, which in the indie world was at that time successful, he was like, no, that's not good enough. We should be selling millions of records. And I was like, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was not thinking that we're going to sign bands that will sell millions of records. That was not in my frame of mind at all. I did not think that was possible coming from where I did, where, things change quickly, that's for sure.
You specifically stated, potential problems that may run into with the label. When those exact problems you foretold actually did happen, I'm assuming you weren't surprised. So how did you take it?
Like you said, I wasn't surprised. I mean, I think the trajectory of that record, that is them going off to make the record on their own, the record label stamping their feet about it and trying to get them to change it, them ultimately making some changes, the record coming out in a way that was less than satisfying for me, given that their record label and their management tried to scapegoat me like pretty aggressively prior to the release. Like all of that whole trajectory, I think that was kind of preordained. I don't think there's any way they could have gotten out of that record without something like that happening. Whoever their engineer was, something on that spectrum was going to happen. Some combination of those events was going to happen. I'll never forget the moment. There was a moment, maybe 6 months or so after the release of that record, where I did the books on the studio, and I paid all the utilities, and I paid the salaries for the other employees, and I paid the insurance, and I paid everything, and I had 50 cents in the bank. Like my bank balance after paying all my bills and doing payroll and the mortgage and everything, my bank balance was 50 cents. And that was, unusual for me at the time, because I had been working very steadily and I had built up a bit of a cushion, which allowed me to survive that fallow period. The band made the record on their own terms.
You first met Kurt at a Big Black concert in '87, is this correct?
Yeah, that was another thing that I didn't know at the time that I was talking to him. I found that out later during the session, was that my band Big Black played its last ever concert at the Georgetown Steam Plant on Boeing Field in Seattle. And Kurt was at that show, and he, after the show, like at the end of the show, as a kind of a nod to the finality of the event, of this being our last show, we smashed all of our guitars and stuff on stage. At the end of the show, this kid came up to me and picked up a piece of my broken guitar off the stage, and he asked me if he could keep it. And I said, yeah, sure. It's garbage now.
Yeah.
And then I found out through working on the session that kid that had asked me about taking a piece of my guitar was Kurt Cobain.
No way, really? Did you ever end up talking to him about that?
I mean, that much. That's what we talked. You've just heard the whole story.
One of the distinctive elements of In Utero, in my opinion, is the raspiness of Kurt's voice. Like, I mean, he screams at all the records, but I really find with Bleach and In Utero in particular, he's really letting loose. With a song like Tourette's, he's basically just screaming the whole time. Did he ever blow out his voice when he was recording that record?
I don't recall anything specific, although he basically sang the whole album in one go, and I think he paced it so that the less demanding songs would be early in the session, and then the harsher songs would be at the end. And then I do recall him coming in the next day and revisiting a couple of those songs, either redoing parts or whole chunks of songs.
The first song you guys did was Serve the Servants. Did you get any of the arrangements for the music before you started recording, or was everything just you get there and for the first time you're hearing these songs?
They had sent me Rio demo, which was a demo tape that they had made in Rio de Janeiro that had most of the songs from the session and a few loose jams. The arrangements were all pretty worked out, and Kurt had ideas about, for each song, he had little extra bits that he wanted to do, either a second guitar or a contrasting part he wanted to add that wasn't necessarily structural, but there would be like, okay, well, we get to this bit, it's going to be a second guitar that's going to take over or going to join. And there wasn't not a lot of it was extemporaneous. Almost all of it was, in one way or another, was worked out. Kurt had a notebook that had his lyrics and his song ideas in it. In that notebook, he also had articulated specific things about the guitar sound, like he wanted to swap amplifiers for certain songs. He used a Randall amplifier for some of it. He used, the bulk of it was this broken Fender quad reverb that he really liked. Serve the Servant specifically, I know that he used this broken quad reverb, and it was missing 3 of the 4 power tubes. So the output of the amplifier was, in technical terms, it was asymmetrical, meaning that there would be distortion on one half of the waveform and not on the other half. And that would be, an unusual thing, but it had a very harsh, distorted sound, but Kurt was actually quite fond of that harshness. And so that was a big part of that record, was him choosing a very specific voicing for each guitar.
Is there anything in particular about these sessions that stick out to you?
There are a couple of very specific things about Kurt's approach that were unique at the time and remain unique. He essentially sang the entire album in one sitting.
Really?
I think he came back the next day and did a few of the songs that, he may have redone a song or did a few of the songs that he didn't get to the first day. But essentially, we started the vocal tracking, and then we just pressed on that whole day, and he sang the whole album. That by itself is pretty unusual. His approach to singing was that while he was singing, he always wanted to be playing an instrument of some kind. In the beginning, he had this percussion instrument called a rain stick that he was toying with while he was doing the vocals. Mm-hmm. And it made this, brutal rattling sound that was picking up in the vocal microphones. And then when he heard the first playback, he was like, hey, can you get rid of that rain stick? And I was like, yeah, sorry, that's built in, So he ended up re-singing that song, but, and then he switched to this slightly broken acoustic guitar. He had this acoustic guitar that had a cracked top and had very old, very dead strings, and he would just strum along quietly while he was preparing to sing the song. And there are a couple of songs where you can hear this acoustic guitar sort of accompanying the quiet bits of the verse. And that wasn't a separate recording of an acoustic guitar. That was just the acoustic guitar he was carrying in his lap that he was using as a sort of a rhythmic confidence item
during the singing. And so that acoustic guitar was a byproduct of his method of recording the vocals. I felt like he was being very square and very open with me during the session. Like he would tell me what he liked and what he didn't like, and I believed him.
Mm-hmm. Is it true that they set their pants on fire when you guys finished the record?
There's a cleaning solvent that you use to clean the tape heads on the tape machines, which is very flammable. And you can also splash that solvent on something else and set it on fire. And so we were setting a lot of stuff on fire during the session, just, jackass entertainment sort of stuff. There's a photo somewhere, I can't remember who took it, but there was an Instamatic or a Polaroid photo of Dave Grohl's ass on fire, and I think it's Chris Novoselic is lighting a cigar off of the fire that's on Dave Grohl's ass. I would set my feet on fire every now and again. All that sort of stuff is just killing time in the studio.
Didn't hurt at all or anything?
No, that's what's cool about it. The solvent evaporates as it's burning, so it's cooling you down while it's burning. So.
And there's no fire alarms or anything in the building?
I mean, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, but maybe not,
Cool. So now, was the session, I take it was a fun session. Like, did you enjoy working with the band?
Yeah, we got along great. Like, I wasn't the biggest fan of Nirvana going into the session. I have to admit that. I wasn't that familiar with their music, but what I had heard had been kind of thrust at me by the hype machine, and I wasn't into it. It wasn't my cup of tea. Getting to work with them, getting to see them in action, the way the band interacted with each other internally, the way Kurt expressed himself, and the way he sort of openly indulged his influences, all of that was very endearing, and I developed a great respect for them as a band and for Kurt as a guy. And I think they were a great band, and I think that's a great record, and I'll always be gratified that I was involved in those sessions.
What was your favorite song to work on during the recording sessions?
I remember really liking the Milk It song.
Really? Yeah.
And then there was the one that we were calling the Name Game. The one that goes ba 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 da ba da 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 da.
Scentless Apprentice?
Yeah. I remember at the time, Dave Grohl called it the Name Game because the rhythm is sort of Charlie, Charlie, faux farley, banana, fana, faux farley, like that. It has the same rhythm as the Name Game. Yeah, I thought that was a really distinctive use of that rhythm, which is underutilized.
Now, I know that Kurt was a big fan of the Pixies, and one of the reasons he wanted to work with you in particular was your work you've done with them.
Well, the fundamental aspects of the sessions, the Pixie session and the Nirvana session, were very similar. That is, the band played the material live as a performing ensemble. There were some extra bits added as overdubs, but the principal sound that you're hearing is the sound of that band playing live together. Yeah, so in that sense, they're very similar. That's a working method that I've used for all types of music and all kinds of ensembles. If the band is capable of playing simultaneously, mm-hmm. then you get the best interaction, the most natural together sound quality by having them play together normally as they mm-hmm. would in rehearsal or on stage. So that aspect of it was the same identically. Some of the recording techniques with respect to the drum kit and the guitars, for example, were the same. Mm-hmm. That's just by virtue of the fact that I had been through a long experimental process of trying to find techniques that worked for different sound qualities, and some of the sonorities and some of the sound qualities were similar. Mm-hmm. Like they wanted a big booming ambient drum sound, so I made use of the ambient sound of the room in the same, very similar manner to the way I did with the Pixies. There were some songs that had a very brash, very aggressive sound quality, and so I would modify the recording style there. We moved the drums, for example, from the large live room into a much smaller ante-room that was sort of a kitchen entrance area that was a non-professional space. That is, it wasn't designed as an acoustic space, but it had a nice, lively sound quality. So for some of the more brash, more aggressive songs, we shifted the drums into this smaller, brighter room.
Okay.
For example. And those are, those things suiting the sound quality to the song in question. Mm-hmm. Those are things that would be normal for any session.
Within the pantheon of the thousands of albums that you worked on, where would you rank In Utero in terms of your personal preference?
Well, I don't listen to a lot of records that I've worked on for fun. There's something slightly vain about that makes me uncomfortable. So I don't listen to a lot of music that I've worked on for entertainment. But whenever I hear that record, I'm always very satisfied with the way it came out.
In 2013, when you got to go back to the vaults and do the deluxe edition with the band, how was that experience for you?
The best thing that I can say about that experience was great. Like getting to rekindle my friendship with Chris Novoselic and getting to spend time with Chris and Dave and Pat, like that experience was great. Mm-hmm. And hearing those original recordings again was immensely satisfying because, just listening to the playback of the final tape, the final mixes of the original session, I was so satisfied with all the decisions that we'd made. And I was very pleased that the sound quality was as good as I remembered it being. And, and I was very pleased that we were getting a chance to see it through in a manner that wasn't possible in the 90s,
Yeah.
Granted, Nirvana were a very big band in the 90s, but they were also one of a couple of dozen records that came out that month. So they weren't going to get the kind of specific, intimate attention that you could lavish on a record that you knew had an audience waiting and where you knew that the cost was not going to be an obstacle,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have to give the band credit here. They asked my opinion about what would be the best way to do a reissue for the record. And I said, go to the original master tapes, use the best possible cutting technique for the vinyl master, which is the DMM process. And my suggestion was to do it at Abbey Road, where I had very good results mastering records over the years. And to have me supervise the cut. And if possible, to do it as an expanded double disc 12-inch 45. And they went for all of it. They said, yep, let's do it. Let's do all of that stuff. And I honestly don't know how to do it better. Like if somebody said, what steps would you take to make the best possible master from a recording that you'd done? Mm-hmm. I would say, let's do all of these steps in this way. And Nirvana did all of those steps in that way. And they went to bat for that process with the record label. I don't know what the record label would have originally been prepared to do, mm-hmm. but the band went to bat for that method, and they made it clear that's how they wanted to proceed. And the results speak for themselves. I think that's the best sounding record that I've ever been associated with in terms of the sound quality of the record as it relates to the sound quality of the master material. Like if you play the double 12-inch deluxe edition of that record at home, you are hearing as close to what we heard in the studio as it is possible to get.
I saw a video from a while back. You found these microphones that you used to record In Utero, and you donated them to the band or whatever it was. Do you have any memorabilia from the sessions that you've kept for yourself?
Honestly, I can't think of anything. I know that at the time, like when we did that session, the mics that I was using on Kurt's voice were easily identifiable. And then there was after the deluxe edition came out, there was a photograph that Bob Weston had taken, a picture of those microphones in the arrangement that was used for the vocal recording. And I realized at that point that what those microphones was less tools that I could use on a daily basis and more artifacts that were of historical significance. If I couldn't identify which microphones they were, then it wouldn't concern me. Then I would just carry on using them as normal. But because it was obvious which specific microphones they were, then you have this relic which has intrinsic value because of its association, right? And then it becomes irresponsible to risk that by putting it on a mic stand where it could get kicked over and smashed. And it becomes a liability if that thing has intrinsic value, that you then put it in harm's way where it could get destroyed. Like it's like having the original copy of the Constitution on your coffee table where somebody could spill coffee on it. You know? It made me uncomfortable, and I contacted Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic, and I said, hey, I have these microphones. They are clearly very valuable now, whereas previously they were just sort of workman-like tools. Do you have a central repository for Nirvana relics? Do you want them? And both of them instantly, like without hesitation, both of them said, you should sell those mics. And it seemed like that was the way to get them into the hands of somebody who would be a responsible caretaker for them. And so we sold them. We made a pretty good clip of money on them, but the money wasn't enough to make it worth selling something of significance if it wasn't going to be a better utility for those mics than having them here where they would be in danger every day.
I heard something I thought it was quite funny about you during the sessions. Apparently you did a prank call to Eddie Vedder and pretended you were David Bowie's producer.
Yeah, there were a number of opportunities for prank calls during that session. The Eddie Vedder one, there was a kind of a good-natured rivalry between Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Like Pearl Jam were sort of the corporate face of the era. You know, the band was kind of assembled from constituent parts and was shopped as a product, and then it was very much an industry creation, as it were. Whereas Nirvana were a grubby band that played in all the punk bars and worked their way up, sort of incrementally worked their way up to a position of status, and where their audience just grew organically because they kept playing in front of more and more people, and more people were responding to them. And so there was a contrast there between the sort of working musician underground, which I felt like I was a part of, and which Nirvana were a part of, and where we had a common peer group, and then this sort of industry creation, which was at odds with their ethics and their aesthetic. So there was a bit of a rivalry between Pearl Jam and Nirvana in that regard. It was just a sort of a spontaneous spoof called Eddie Vedder, and I said that I was Tony Visconti.
Tony Visconti?
Yeah, so we called Eddie Vedder, and I said that, I was Tony Visconti, and I wanted to get him in a studio with some real musicians, guys who could really play. I don't remember much else about the conversation, but the gist of it was that I was trying to tempt him to do a solo record and assemble a superstar backing band for him.
And did he fall for it?
I don't know. I mean, he indulged me, but I couldn't tell if he was indulging me because he thought I was really Tony Visconti, or because he didn't want to take the bait on something that might have been a prank call.
So if Nirvana was around today, given how dispersed things are, and given the nature of the internet and how it's hard to just pinpoint one person, do you think they would have become as big as they did?
Everything that happens is a confluence of the circumstances and the influences of the time. So at the moment, nobody watches MTV for music videos. So if a band had a moment of success due to a successful music video, that avenue is probably not there anymore. if there was a band that had a successful hype campaign and payola and were being splashed on the radio a lot, now nobody listens to the radio. So who knows if that would have any effect whatsoever. It's just the world operates differently now. And I'd like to think that a stylish and distinctive band that is a unique and genuine aesthetic, like that they would still find an audience. I do think that there's a kind of an appeal to authenticity that rock music fans have that I think is misguided. Like, people think of learning to play the guitar and playing the guitar is somehow validating, whereas learning to use a sampler and assembling ideas using digital techniques for whatever reason isn't valid. I think that's a specious argument. I think that, I don't think these little turf battles have meaning. I learned to play the guitar and I use the guitar because that's my instrument of facility, right? But I can't denigrate somebody else using different techniques and different tools to express themselves. I don't see that one idiom is fundamentally better or more valid or more authentic than another. If I were to leap into the computerized world of digital music right now, I would be bad at it. And it doesn't appeal to me enough to make me want to overcome that hurdle and become good at it. So I'm going to persist with the tools that I'm already proficient with and hope that my ideas can transcend the execution, right? Mm-hmm. By the same token, I wouldn't expect somebody whose only experience with music is doing sample collages and using MIDI instruments and that sort of thing. I wouldn't expect that person to be able to translate to a live performance model comfortably and easily. I think that would be a mistaken expectation as well.
So Steve, you yourself are well known for your high quality of drum production, and you have worked with some of the world's most iconic drummers, including, of course, Dave Grohl. So what was that experience like for you, being someone that is an aficionado when it comes to recording drums, to get to work with someone at Dave Grohl's caliber?
Dave is a monster. He's a very good musician, sort of generally, but there really are very few drummers of his caliber on Earth or who have ever lived. He's often associated with the most powerful moments of Nirvana because, he had a very physical approach to the drums. But I think his tastefulness and his tact and his dynamic sense are underrated. On quite a few of the songs, he scales everything back to a very simple, very clean rhythm in the quieter parts of the songs in order to give himself headroom to really attack the drums in the louder parts of the songs. And I think that's something that he doesn't get enough credit for, of really playing to the arrangement of the music and playing to the dynamic of the song. I don't think he gets enough credit for that. His drum parts themselves are inventive. Like on that record alone, there are 2 or 3 drum beats where if you just play a bar of the drums, people would know which song it was because the drums are as much of an identifier of the music or as much of a signature riff as any other part of the music.
So you really feel that Dave is one of the best drummers of all time?
Easily, yeah. Wow. I mean, certainly, I've worked with a lot of drummers. I've worked with some phenomenal drummers, real world beaters, real crushers. And he's at the very, very top of my experience recording drummers.
That's quite the compliment.
So my skill set with recording drums developed over the years by recording the loudest and most aggressive drummers out there. I was able to use a fairly normal approach, that is close mics on the drums, distant ambient mics to capture the room sound. My approach to the drum kit is not to try to record the individual drums as isolated sounds, but to record the whole of the drum kit I've always thought of it sort of as a kind of bully's piano, like you wouldn't try to record the individual strings and hammers of the piano and then reassemble them in the mixing stage. You try to capture the sound quality of the whole piano and present it that way. You can shift the emphasis one way or the other using mic placement or technique, but the net effect of it should be that it should evoke the sensation of listening to a single instrument. And that's the way I've always approached the drums. Is you might have a mic that's specifically for the bass drum, but you're not recording the bass drum in isolation of the other sounds. There's a microphone that's recording the snare drum, but that microphone is also hearing the rest of the drum kit in the ambient environment, that sort of thing.
So what about Chris Novoselic? How does he line up in the bass world?
He's an interesting guy, very cerebral guy. And I think his perception of his role in the band was not particularly well voiced in his bass playing. Like his bass playing was very solid and tonally was very deep and very heavy. He had, there would occasionally be lighter moments where he would be playing chordal stuff or playing up the neck, whatever, but most of the time he was playing sort of the left hand of the piano, as it were, where like he was playing the tonic movement of the music, and Kurt was adding all of the harmonic and emotional content, but the song carried on because you could tell the song was carrying on no matter how wild the guitar got, because Chris was sort of keeping his pace through the whole thing, as opposed to like going off on a journey on his own,
With your session, if I remember correctly, you guys recorded 14 songs. 12 got on the record. Sappy and I Hate Myself and Want to Die were not included. Do you know why those two songs were not included on the release?
Not my call. Yeah, I wasn't involved in those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
There was also a song, one of Dave Grohl's songs, Marigold, that ended up being used as a B-side that was recorded during the same sessions.
Did you record the Marigold record?
Recorded the basic recording of it, but the greater production of it, that is the overdubs and the mixing and everything, Dave Grohl did that as a sort of a side hustle with Bob Weston as the principal engineer. Bob Weston was there with me the whole time. He was there to make sure that if there were technical problems that we could get stuff fixed on the spot. And it was very helpful. It sort of cemented our friendship as well, working in that kind of an environment. And his girlfriend at the time was the chef for the session. Like, she was living there and she was doing all the meals and meal prep for the daily ordeal there.
Although not officially released as part of In Utero, Marigold does appear on the box set With the Lights Out, which was released in 2004. And Dave Grohl has stated that during the early stages of the Foo Fighters, when most people at that point in time still knew him predominantly as Nirvana's drummer, audiences at the early Foo Fighters crowds would often enthusiastically cheer and ask for Dave to perform Marigold. Even so, Marigold was not performed live until July 14, 2006, during a Foo Fighters concert, and it would be played throughout the rest of that tour. The original title for Marigold was Color Pictures of a Marigold, marigolds being a yellowish-orange flower. I've read different things about how you and the band got in touch. I read that you heard rumors and you sent them a fax saying that you don't really know if you're working with them. How exactly did you guys end up working together?
The stories you've heard are correct. Like, there were rumors being floated in the press that I was going to be asked to work on this postulated next Nirvana album, but no one had contacted me. Like, officially, no one had spoken to me about it. I had gotten a few late night phone calls from what I later discerned was Kurt Cobain, but at the time I was just a disembodied voice on the phone of someone quite inebriated wanting to talk about various records I'd worked on. Kurt saying, yeah, I'm sorry about those rumors, but, we were talking within the band and in front of other people. We were talking about asking you to work on this record. What would you think about it? And then he and I had a fairly involved conversation about what would be entailed in making a record, sort of recapped in a letter that I wrote so that the other band members could basically have all the info that I had given Kurt in that phone call. So I wrote a letter to the band explaining my position of, I want to work on your record in the way that I work on everybody's records. That is, you and me would go to the studio, you would make the decisions, I would help you make the record. We wouldn't listen to anybody outside that core group. And if you wanted to make a record that way, then I'm happy to give it a shot. And that was sort of the working method, and that was articulated in that letter. And I also talked about, the nuts and bolts stuff, like how much time it would take, what studio options should be, how I would go about getting paid, who would be responsible for paying me, how much money I would be willing to take, and yada yada. All of that all sort of boiled down into a synopsis that was then shared with the rest of the band. I knew that in their position, Nirvana were going to be badgered by other people wanting to glom on to their success and wanting to siphon off some of their credibility for themselves, and that there were going to be a lot of people leeching off of them. For my own peace of mind and for their peace of mind, I wanted them to know that they didn't have to worry about me and be confident that I was going to do a good job without any of the distractions of the celebrity lifestyle or any of that sort of thing. They went outside the record label system and made a record on their own and then brought it back to the label and said, "This is our record, please put it out." That behavior, that act, represented a threat to the paradigm of the record label, where the record label is in charge and responsible for significant decisions about a band's career, right?
Yeah.
So they had an incentive to see that method failed and that the band wasn't allowed to proceed with putting a record out that they had made on their own terms.
Mm-hmm.
So they were incentivized to try to get the band to scrap the record and do it again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to the band's credit, it's to Nirvana's credit, that they said, no, this is the way we did it, and that we like this record and we want to put it out. In the end, there were a few songs that were remixed. I genuinely believe that was because the band found fault with those original mixes. I don't believe that it was done as a concession to the record label, although it could be viewed that way, and it could be a coincidence that the singles were the songs that were ended up being reworked. But I genuinely believe that the band had reservations and they wanted to rework those songs, so they did. And in the end, the album that made its way into the stores, the album that you could go buy, was precisely exactly the album that the band wanted you to hear. There's no way to work the math where I didn't cost myself $1 million or so by not taking a royalty on that record. As a nominal figure, let's say the band was getting 12 points or 12% of the income of the record. Mm-hmm. And the producer was being paid a couple of those, literally be subtracted from the band's income. Given the other expenses that the band has to carry, how it would almost always work out that the producer would be being paid more than the band members.
Really?
And that was by design. That's the way the industry was structured, so that industry players would be overcompensated and that musicians would be undercompensated, and band members and songwriters would be undercompensated. And I just didn't want to participate in that system. I thought that system was corrupt and unethical, and I did not want to be, in the same way that I did not want to be one of the people leeching off of Nirvana's success and popularity on a personal level. I didn't want to be a drag on their income. I didn't want to be a drain on the hard-won compensation that they were going to be getting. Like, they did the hard part of writing all this music and touring the world and becoming popular and famous, and then they did the hard part in the studio of executing it all, and then they were going to have to do the hard part of carrying that record around with them for the rest of their lives as part of their legacy. And I just didn't see, I still don't see it as ethical for me to insist on being paid forever for a couple of weeks' work. It just seems unconscionable to me. So I just refuse to participate in that kind of arrangement. And also, like, I like doing my job. I like making records for people. And so that means as long as I can keep getting work, as long as I keep making records for people, I should have a steady income. And I shouldn't make it other people's responsibility to pay me for having done a job a while ago. Like, it just seems like that just seems reasonable. All of these positions seem like normal thought processes to me. It doesn't seem strange or unusual. It's only in the perverse context of the norms of the music business where that could be seen as unusual thinking. All that you can ask from an artist is for them to have a vision, to see their vision through to satisfactory completion, and then present it to you in a manner that they are comfortable with. Mm-hmm. Like, Nirvana said, yeah, this is our album, it's finished, this is what we want you to buy, and that was it. It's their record, they're allowed to make those decisions, and the fact that it might bruise my feelings slightly that, you know, something that I worked on got reworked slightly, that's completely irrelevant.
When you did the In Utero sessions, you did, I think, 6 songs, but only one of them had vocals. Is this correct?
Correct.
Do you remember why you guys didn't record vocals for the other 5 songs you guys did for the In Utero sessions?
Kurt couldn't be bothered. Just didn't want to. He did one vocal and then said, all right, we're done.
Really?
That was it. Now, they booked 2 days at least, and the whole first day, nobody showed up.
Really?
I basically was sitting in the studio. If I remember correctly, it was either the first... When they finally showed up, it was evening. Whether there was an entire day when they didn't show up, I honestly don't remember. I may be exaggerating. But I do know they kind of annoyed me because I expected them to show up, you know, on time, eager to record like most people were, but they didn't. When they finally showed up, they banged through 6 songs. And it was the only time I recorded Dave Grohl in the studio. And there's a funny story about this, which was all the time I'd been working in this building for 5 years as reciprocal recording and for 2 years as word-of-mouth recording. We never had, we had one noise complaint from the police in like 1987 or something like that. Mm-hmm. Never again until I had Dave Grohl playing drums in the building, because he was so loud. And police actually came to the door, and I tried to explain to them, I've got Nirvana in here, and they didn't really care who it was. They just said, can you keep it down a little? But, I think we had one more song to record or something, and, that was that. So that was a funny thing about the In Utero demo, was the police coming and complaining about the noise, because, to this day, I don't think there's been another noise complaint, and that's been a studio ever since then. And it was a studio since the 70s, and it just never got noise complaints. So, go figure.
It's funny.
Whatever passed for mixing, again, took place very quickly. I know I'm thinking probably Kurt showed up the next day to do the vocals, and Courtney was there, and so was Francis, because he had the baby on his lap at one point. Which is why you hear a baby crying in the middle of the song.
Which song is this?
Rape Me.
This is the demo that you did for Rape Me?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the only song from those 6 that has a vocal. Yeah, there's not even a guide vocal. So, of course, I didn't, he told me the titles at the time, such as they were, and it's unfortunate, really, because without a vocal, they're not very interesting. I did what mix I could of Rape Me for the box set, and much later for the deluxe In Utero reissue, they let me remix a couple of other things, including a couple of Brazil recordings that they did with Craig Montgomery.
Oh, you were involved with those ones too?
Yes, there's 2, I think, that I remixed that are on For some reason, were not on the box set, so I remixed those, and those are on the In Utero Deluxe CD edition. So I think the 2 or 3 of the instrumental tunes from the In Utero demo, I mixed those. This is like much, much later. And 2 of the Brazil recordings, I remixed those. So that stuff is on the In Utero Deluxe reissue, which the Rape Me version should have been used there too, but because they'd already used it on the box set, they didn't use it on the In Utero reissue. This stuff has all been scattered all over the place. It's unfortunate. Like all the Dale demo stuff, that should be in one place. But, some of it's on Bleach, some of it's on Incesticide, some of it's on the box set. It's just how these things ended up.
Did they approach you independently to do the In Utero demos, or was it facilitated through a label?
Some representative called. I don't think it was the label. Somebody from whatever management they had at the time, I don't know who it was, called to book the time. And in fact, they initially booked the time and then canceled it because Francis was born, and they were a little busy with a newborn baby, actually. So, I kind of said, well, okay, that's a pretty good excuse for canceling a session, fine, and then they rescheduled. And Courtney showed up and brought the baby. It was pretty cute, I have to tell you. They were just like any pair of, googly goggly parents with a newborn baby. It was way too cute. They just said, call our management and bill them, and they billed the label, and there were no questions asked. I mean, this was after Nevermind, so the money was there, and this was word of mouth recording. I mean, we're talking, maybe $1,000 or something. It wasn't much of a bill, for a couple of days. It was trivial it was peanuts as far as the label was concerned. A, they were demos, and B, the other thing is nobody really cared. The tapes actually sat on the shelf for a couple of years. And I eventually, when the studio closed in 93, I had to call him and say, look, can I send these tapes to somebody? I mean, nobody ever asked for the demos. The band walked out with a cassette, I think, but nobody was in control, it seemed like. I did the recordings and was waiting for somebody to go, hey, can we hear them? And I never heard a thing. It was odd. It was a strange session. I think it was more just for the band to get the songs into their heads, really, than for any other purpose. I'm not sure that anybody at the label was, I never heard a damn thing.
Do you know why the band specifically wanted to record with you those demos? Would you happen to know?
They were still, based in the Pacific Northwest, if you will, and I was familiar and friendly and easy to deal with, so... and required the minimal amount of effort and travel. And I think they felt a little overwhelmed with the whole recording process for Nevermind, and, having to travel to the Midwest and deal with people they didn't know, and, the guy there, and they love Butch, and then, having some guy in LA mix it and, going through that whole, I think they wanted to do something quick and simple and easy at that point, hence calling me up and saying, hey, we want to record some songs on the 8-track machine. Now, I was under no illusions that I was recording the next Nirvana record at that point. I knew that they were just going to bang out some demos. So I was hoping they would at least, finish the vocals. But, I think Kurt left and he said, oh, yeah, we'll come back and finish the vocals later. And they never did. And nobody ever called for the tapes. So it was a strange session. Yeah, this was, they weren't called the In Utero demo sessions because, of course, there was no In Utero yet. This was in, 92, I think? A full year and a half, I think, before In Utero was actually released. Yeah, they came in and they said, at this point, reciprocal recording was closed. The building still had a recording studio in it, which was called Word of Mouth Recording. And it was different equipment, but we still had the old reciprocal recording 8-track machine in the building. And Chris and Kurt specifically wanted to use the 8-track machine just for old time's sake, plus, because A, I think they knew they were demos, and B, they enjoyed the sound of it. And I think they recorded, I'd have to look at my own diaries and notes to really say this definitively, because I remember waiting around a whole day and having the band finally show up in the evening sometime.
Was that the first time you met Dave Grohl, those sessions?
I think not. I think the first time I met Dave Grohl was at the Crocodile, and I seem to remember, I don't even think it wasn't even a Nirvana show. He just happened to be hanging out at the Crocodile Cafe. I think that's the first time I met him, and so, I mean, him and Chris were hanging out or something, and someone introduced me. I don't remember much about it, but I'm pretty sure I met him briefly before that, and that was the only other time. Other than decades later in Brooklyn at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame thing, I don't know if I saw him again.
Hey guys, now I'm going to give you a breakdown of every single song on Nevermind and In Utero, in order of the track listing. First with Nevermind, and then In Utero. This is from Nirvana Facts by John D. Lurson. Quote,
before it became the biggest rock song of the 90s, Smells Like Teen Spirit was merely the lead single and opening number on Nevermind. Penned in Nirvana's rehearsals by Cobain, Novoselic, and Grohl just weeks before they entered Sound City Studios, the song was the first of several numbers on the band's DGC debut to use the soft verse loud chorus formula. With its 4-chord riff in the intro and the chorus, Teen Spirit resonated immediately with indie rock kids, metalheads, and general rock fans. I was trying to write the ultimate pop song. I was basically trying to rip off the Pixies. I have to admit it. Cobain told Rolling Stone in January of '94. Expressing his love of the Boston band who had produced such classics as 1988's Surfer Rosa and the following year's Doolittle. We used their sense of dynamics being quiet and soft and then loud and hard. Kurt had the main riff and hook when he brought the song into the practice room. Together, he and his bandmates played the main riff for an hour and a half before it dawned on Chris to slow the song down in the verses, incorporating Chris' memorable bass line and Grohl's drum beat, which gave the song the added stamp it needed. The song that became the group's biggest hit was given a shared writing credit. Despite having different chord progressions, the song's double-track guitar line has been compared by some to Dinosaur Jr.'s Freak Scene, and by others to Boston's 1976 classic More Than a Feeling. Cobain agreed with the second comparison. He called it such a cliched riff in 1994, explaining to writer David Frick it was so close to a Boston riff or the Kingsmen's Louie Louie. According to the producer Butch Vig, who advised the band to trim the chorus, the trio made 3 attempts at the basic track, selecting the second version. Kurt cut just 3 vocal takes, and Vig cherry-picked the best parts of each for the final version. In 2001, Dave Grohl remembered the band being shocked the first time it came through the speakers. Quote, we were used to hearing it sound like a crappy bootleg. All of a sudden, you have Butch Vig making it sound like Led Zeppelin 4. End quote. Kurt Cobain once suggested that after spending time spray painting buildings around Olympia and discussing punk rock and anarchism with Kathleen Hanna, he felt that the aforementioned graffiti, Kurt Smells Like Teen Spirit, left by her in his bedroom wall had rebellious implications. Teen Spirit is basically just about friends, Kurt said in a transcript of a 1991 interview with the Seattle Times. We still feel as if we're teenagers because we don't follow the guidelines of what we're expected to do as adults. We still screw around and have a good time. It also has a kind of like a teen revolutionary theme to it. Cobain was supposedly unaware that Hannah was referring to the scent of Toby Vale's deodorant brand, Teen Spirit, Toby Vale having been Kurt Cobain's girlfriend at the time. In fact, he contended he did not know that such a product even existed until long after the single had been released. In a September 2007 Seattle Weekly column, Chris Novoselic wrote that upon seeing the spray-painted phrase on Kurt's wall, he thought, too much cheap red wine. Released on radio on August 27, 91, followed by a commercial release on CD on September 10th, the single grew legs in markets where the band had existing fans, exposure on modern rock radio, or both. Neither Geffen's marketing department nor the band's management at Gold Mountain expected the song to be a proper pop hit, but merely one that would help earn attention on the FM dial and on MTV and ultimately lure in an album buyer. But when people started to hear the song, as manager Danny Goldberg would tell Michael Azerrad, it was instantaneous. They heard it on alternative radio and then they rushed out like lemmings to buy it. MTV picked up the video for the song in October, giving the clip its world premiere on the weekly alternative program 120 Minutes, before putting it in heavy buzzbin rotation where it stayed until the end of the year. Meanwhile, the song had become a favorite on the network's metal show Headbangers Ball, giving Nirvana, like Faith No More and Jane's Addiction before them, the rare distinction of reaching all of rock's radio formats, from hard rock and album rock to modern rock and college radio. If Top 40 radio was slow to catch on because of the group's harder sound, by the time 1991 ended, Teen Spirit had made it all the way to number 6 on Billboard's pop singles survey. It was named the best single of 1991 in the Village Voice's Paz and Job Critics poll, and of course would also catapult Nevermind to the top of the album charts around the globe. Eventually, the single would earn an RIAA Platinum certification for 1 million copies sold, and the track was the main impetus for its parent album to sell more than 10 million copies in the US alone. Smells Like Teen Spirit would earn Grammy nominations in categories of Best Hard Rock Performance with Vocal and Best Hard Rock Song. It lost the latter to Eric Clapton's Unplugged reworking of Derek and the Dominoes' Layla. Still, such recognition, critics suggested the song was the anthem of a generation, left the men in Nirvana uncomfortable. The song received such overexposure that by the end of '93, Cobain felt embarrassed and was reluctant to play it. Yet its legacy has not diminished in subsequent years. In 2000, MTV and Rolling Stone ranked the song third on their joint list of the 100 best songs of all time, behind the Beatles' enduring Yesterday and the Stones' rock classic I Can't Get No Satisfaction. When asked by Frick in 01 if he had any sense of what was to come on the eve of the song's release, Dave Grohl said it didn't seem possible, citing the pop fare of Mariah Carey and Michael Bolton that had been ruling the charts. It seemed like we were about to make another pass through the underground. One of the first people to say they thought the album was going to be huge was Donita Sparks of L7, and I didn't believe her. I was going, there's absolutely no way. In 2011, Butch Vig told the story of Dave Grohl trying to hit the high harmony vocals on In Bloom while they were recording the song in studio. In Bloom, of course, being the second song on Nevermind and the fourth and final single from the album. According to the producer, Grohl's voice sounded, quote, amazingly like Kurt's and it blended really well. Dave told me I have to pull a Keith Richards, Vig told Billboard. So he'd take a sip of Jack Daniels and a puff from a cigarette. He'd get halfway through a line and his voice would start to break up. I remember all of us laughing and laughing. By the time he got the vocal done, I think he had drank half a bottle of Jack Daniels. Prior to this, Cobain and Lead's vocals continued to get increasingly loud during the making of the song, which forced Vig to alter the input levels to keep the volume balance between the verses and the choruses. As with Kurt's vocals, which were double-tracked, Dave's parts were recorded twice. In Bloom was one of the first tunes they attempted at Sound City, and because Nirvana had previously recorded it a year earlier during its Smart Studio session with Butch Vig, they all agreed it made a good starting point. Like the other carryovers from that April 1990 session with Butch Vig, the song remains largely unchanged with the exception of the differences in style between Dave Grohl and Chad Channing's playing on drums. In one interview, Novoselic explained that In Bloom had originally reminded him of a Bad Brains number until Cobain went home and morphed it into a pop song. Kurt employed the quiet verse loud choruses approach when he performed a revised version of the tune for the bassist over the telephone. It's been suggested that the song is about Kurt's friend Dylan Carlson, who liked to shoot guns. Others have suggested that it had a broader meaning and was directed at newer fans of Nirvana who were from the outside of the underground and misunderstood the band's intentions. But the reality is that while tracking the song at Van Nuys in May, or during the original sessions in Madison at Smart Studios a year before, no one in Nirvana could have predicted that so many jocks and metalheads would flock to the band that fall. By the time the single was commercially released in the UK, where it reached number 28 on November 30th, 1992, Nirvana had ballooned into one of rock's biggest bands. In the US, there was only a promotional release as DGC, Nirvana's label, had already turned its attention to a new rarities compilation, Incesticide, due for release on December 14th of 1992. When Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were growing up in Aberdeen in the 1970s and 80s, there was a Christian church on Market Street that invited passerbys to come as you are. It is from this sign encouraging people to walk into the house of worship that many, including Doug Barker, managing editor at the local newspaper The Daily World, believe Kurt got the idea for one of Nirvana's most successful songs. Kurt told Australia's Triple J radio station that the song, which uses paradoxes like Take Your Time, Hurry Up, was really contradictory, adding that it was about people and what they're expected to act like. About the line, and I don't have a gun, Kurt added, just because I say I in a song, it doesn't necessarily mean it's me. It's just the way I write. I'll take on someone else's personality or character. My life is kind of boring, so I just take stories from things I've read and off the television, and in stories I've heard, maybe even some friends. Cobain recorded 3 vocal takes of the song at Sound City, of which producer Butch Vig used and then double-tracked the first. Butch Vig also employed Kurt's second attempt at the guitar solo. According to the music writer Jim Birkenstad, Nirvana's frontman mistakenly sang "And I Don't Have a Gun" too soon while overdubbing the harmony. Butch Vig also took a sample of Kurt Cobain singing Memoria midway through the track and used it twice near the end of the song. The mid-tempo recording launches with Kurt's distinctive, twangy 8-second riff, which he played through an effects pedal designated to give his guitar a watery sound. By the time Nirvana and their management were considering the song for Nevermind's second single, they were all well aware that the song's signature guitar part resembled a slowed-down version of the riff heard on Killing Joke's explosive 1984 hit, 80s. In fact, manager Danny Goldberg told Rolling Stone's Kari Borzilo Vrena in 2003 that, quote, Kurt was nervous because it was too similar, end quote. They went for it anyways, releasing Come As You Are as a single on March 3rd, 92. The song reached number 9 on the UK charts before reaching 32 on the US Billboard Hot 100, and its popularity helped drive further sales of Nevermind. That same year, Killing Joke claimed that Nirvana's song plagiarized 80s, although a copyright infringement lawsuit was never filed. Borzilo Vrena's report cited personal and financial reasons, which has led many to believe that the Nirvana camp eventually paid for the UK band's silence. The fourth song on Nevermind, Breed, originally known as Imodium, offered a stylistic link to the approaches on Bleach, notably the repetitive lyrics. A powerhouse of a song propelled by Dave Grohl's rhythmic attack, it conjures up images of what life might be like if things had worked out for Kurt and Toby Vale. He appears to be singing her thoughts and or capturing her dialogue as evidenced by the reappearance of the phrase, she said. As on most of Nevermind, Kurt appears to be reeling from life without Vale, and their past conversations seem to inform the lyrics. Foregoing the pressure of raising a family, we don't have to breed, and just cohabitating, we can plant a house, we can build a tree, it ends up being one of the record's most candidly personal tracks and one of its most musically forceful. The fifth track on Nevermind and the album's third single was Lithium, released commercially on July 21st, 1992. It tells the tale of a man who turns to God after thoughts of killing himself. When asked about the song that year, Cobain described the partly autobiographical, partly fictional song to a fanzine writer named Cake. Quote, the song is about a guy who lost his girlfriend. I can't decide what caused her to die. Let's say she died of AIDS or a car accident or something. And he's going around brooding, and he turned to religion as a last resort to keep himself alive, to keep him from suicide. In the same interview, Kurt went on to cite his Aunt Mary as an example of someone he knew and loved deeply who became disillusioned with her life and wound up feeling suicidal before becoming a born-again Christian. By turning to religion, he explained, she had kept herself alive, for which he was clearly grateful. He also conceded the following year in Come As You Are, the biography, that the song was infused with some of his own experiences, including his time spent with Jesse Reed's family, Jesse Reed being the son of the religious family Kurt stayed with for a period of time as a teenager. Unlike a lot of Cobain's songs, which were pieced together from various poems and musical ideas, Lithium was one he had managed to write from start to finish. During recording, the band struggled to keep a steady tempo. Kurt kept speeding up his playing, with the band following suit. Kurt wanted to be able to play the guitar very, not methodical. It needed to have its space, producer Butch Vig told biographer Michael Azarad. It had to be relaxed. Whenever Kurt sped up, Butch made him redo it, eventually suggesting they use a click track. He also recommended that Grohl and Novoselic simplify the song's rhythm. Upon its release, the CD single, which included full lyrics for the Nevermind album, cover art by Kurt Cobain, and a sonogram of the frontman's then-unborn daughter, Frances Bean, it stalled at number 64 on the Billboard Hot 100, even as its parent album continued to ride high in the album survey. A UK pressing of the single, which boasted the cassette-only Curmudgeon, a live version of Been a Sun, and a cover of the Wipers' D7, tracked during the band's 1990 John Peel session at the BBC, peaked at number 11. Arranged for acoustic guitar, the song Polly is based on a June 1987 incident in which a 14-year-old Washington State girl was kidnapped and raped by a man named Gerald Arthur Friend after he picked her up hitchhiking home from a rock concert at the Tacoma Dome. After Gerald Arthur Friend tortured her with a whip, a razor, and a blowtorch, the teen likely saved her own life by somehow managing to persuade her abductor to untie her. Later, she escaped from his van when he stopped at a gas station and caused a commotion, which led to his capture and conviction. Nirvana recorded this explosive, punk-inspired track directly into the soundboard at Sound City in May of '91. It begins with Novoselic's off-key rendition of the chorus from the Youngbloods' 1967 hippie anthem, Get Together, and was purposely done sardonic. I really don't have an explanation for that song, Cobain told NME in August of '91 when asked about its meaning. A lot of the time I write a song, and when someone asks me about it, I'll make up an explanation on the spot, because a lot of the times I write the lyrics in the studio and I have no idea what I'm talking about. Despite such claims, the lyrics to this cathartic shot of rock and roll suggest Nirvana's creative chief was pretty clear on what he wanted to say. The song found Kurt projecting his support of feminist viewpoints and singing about paranoia and alienation. Some suggest that Drain You was a chronicle of Cobain's split from Vale, while others believe it was about his struggle with heroin, specifically in the line, I travel through a tube and end up in your infection. The The reality is that it may be about both. But when pressed for a meaning, Kurt was quick to suggest it had no real meaning, telling reporters much of it had been made up on the spot. One thing is for sure, the song features more studio trickery than the others on Nevermind. Despite Cobain's aversion to overdubs, Drain You is loaded with 6 layers of guitar work, with Butch Vig supposedly having bamboozled Kurt to record them by telling him that some of the takes were flawed. In the bridge, engineer Andy Wallace took a rubber duck Kurt had brought into the studio and manipulated the quacking sound through a digital delay. The sound of an aerosol can and rattling chains can also be heard during this experimental interlude. With an opening bass line taken from Shocking Blue's Send Me a Postcard, the mid-tempo lounge act was perhaps most memorable for his confessional lyrics. The song is considered by many to be about Toby Vale. When Kurt sings, "I'll arrest myself, I'll wear a shield," he is referring to the K Records tattoo on his forearm, acquired to impress Vale. Elsewhere he sings about fighting jealousy, feeling smothered, and feeling no regrets. In a January 1992 Musician interview, Kurt stated that several of the songs on Nevermind, including this one, stem from, quote, some very personal experiences like breaking up with girlfriends and having bad relationships. Feeling that death void that the person in the song is feeling, very lonely, sick. On the cathartic punk communique Stay Away, Cobain takes aim at people who blindly follow fashion trends and movements and reveals that he'd rather be dead than cool. The lyrics seem to point aim at the Seattle grunge scene he was looking to distance himself from. The song's original title, Pay to Play, also suggests his dissatisfaction with the Emerald City music environment. It was also his way of coming out in support of gay rights. One of Nevermind's many gems, On a Plane was penned by Kurt Cobain in 1990 and originally recorded with Nirvana sound engineer Craig Montgomery in a Seattle studio session on January 1st, 1991. The song, which was released as a radio single in the summer of '92, was then cut in Sound City with producer Butch Vig. According to the producer, Cobain brought a little toy train into the vocal booth during the session at Sound City. He had all these little toys in there and was playing with them during the song, Butch Vig told Billboard in 2011. I remember saying, "Okay, are you ready for the vocals?" And he'd say, "Yeah." So I started rolling the tape and recorded. But he didn't sing. He just recorded all these odd little things through the song. And I thought it was interesting. Then I'd say, "Are you ready to do a vocal?" And he'd said, "Okay, Butch, I guess so." When it was suggested by Flipside in its May June '92 issue that the song's vibe resembled Cheap Trick on Dream Police or Live at Budokan, Kurt was taken aback. "That's weird," he said, revealing he had just been listening to both of those records that same day, before stating, "That song came out way too clean. I'm not happy with the way that came out at all. It should have been a lot rawer. We play it a lot live better, I think. I'll admit, I like Cheap Trick. That first record is great. I keep forgetting how punk rock it really is. It's pretty raw for a commercial rock record." On a Plane begins with an audible hand clap and the sound of a guitar noise before giving way to the hook-injected elements of the song. Cobain's lyrics sound as if they spilled out of him quickly, but the words aren't without meaning. There's a lucidity to the song, which touches on Kurt's struggles with addiction, his issues with writer's block, his feelings of selfishness, and his careening emotional state. After early attempts of a full band version of Something in the Way failed, Kurt sat down with his old Stella 12-string guitar, strung with just 5 nylon strings, and performed a solo rendition of the tune for producer Butch Vig. Butch loved what he heard, and after silencing the studio telephones and air conditioning, he set the control room up to capture Kurt's fragile, unaccompanied version. With Kurt seeping into the couch, Vig was floored. His performance stunned me, the producer told Rolling Stone in '96. He had gone deep inside himself and brought out a haunting portrait of desolation, weariness, and paranoia. From there, Christ and Grohl dubbed their restrained parts. On the final day of recording at Sound City, a guest musician named Kirk Canning was brought in to write and play the cello lines that would augment the recording. The decision to add strings to the song was totally spontaneous and last minute. Canning, who was friendly with Christ, happened to be at the band's LA apartment when Kurt came up with the idea. They brought him to the studio the following day. Something in the Way was played live for the first time several months before it was recorded for Nevermind. This took place on November 25, 1990, at Seattle's Off-Ramp Cafe. The song itself was written earlier in 1990. Endless Nameless. This impromptu instrumental jam was recorded by producer Butch Vig and appended to the second and all subsequent pressings of Nevermind as a hidden track, appearing long after the album's finale proper winds down. When asked about the song by Cake in early '92, Kurt revealed that the band had been working with noise and guitar effects pedals. "It's a little taste of what our next album might sound like," he explained. "I don't want to go too experimental where we turn into a punk rock version of Rush or Yes. I hope we have enough sense to know when to quit." The first song on In Utero is also Kurt's most lyrically direct. The track's opening lines acknowledge the teenage angst payday of Nevermind, but Kurt also lashed out at his critics, whom he branded as self-appointed judges, and belittled the media for its witch hunt against Courtney and its branding of her as a drug addict, bad mother, and a cancer to Nirvana. Perhaps more importantly, he sung about his parents' divorce and the disappointment he felt towards his dad. In the liner notes that he wrote but decided not to use that eventually surfaced though in journals, Cobain acknowledged that he wrote the song in part to voice his frustration at his father Don's lack of communication, his absence from his life, and inability to show affection to him. "I don't need a father-son relationship with a person whom I don't want to spend a boring Christmas with," Kurt wrote. In other words, I love you, I don't hate you, I don't want to talk to you. Serve the Servants is a contagious pop arrangement wrapped in brutal, forceful rock instrumentation. Its keen balance of hooks, distortion, and fury, the three key ingredients in Nirvana's sound, made it an ideal choice to launch the record. Kurt based the lyrics to the album's second number on Patrick Susskind's horror movie Perfume, The Story of a Murderer. The book took the tale of a perfume shop apprentice with a great ability to smell, but no body odor of his own, who began killing virgin women so that he could create the ideal fragrance. The song was credited to Cobain, Grohl, and Novoselic, but its origins were actually Dave's. He brought the guitar riff and drum arrangement to his bandmates, and collectively they honed the music. If this was the rare songwriting collaboration at this point in the trio's existence, when In Utero was released, Kurt admitted that he was actually open to songwriting collaborations again. He explained that by letting Chris and Dave bring their ideas forward, it alleviated the pressure he was feeling to come up with all the songs. Looking back on the roaring, wall-upping sound in January of 2010, Dave Grohl told Mojo, "One of my favorite lines in a Nirvana song is when Kurt sings, 'You can't fire me because I quit.' If there's one line in any song that gives me the chills, it's that one. Maybe all those things that people wrote about him painted him into a corner that he couldn't get out of." Although the chorus to Nirvana's first single from In Utero sounds sarcastic in its delivery, Heart-Shaped Box is Cobain's ultimate love song to Courtney. The line "forever in debt to your priceless advice" was even recycled from a sincere letter he once sent to Love. The title, of course, stems from the box Love apparently gave Kurt when she was courting him. As the label expected, the track took off at alternate radio and quickly topped the Billboard charts, driving CD sales just as the label had hoped. Written on an acoustic guitar in Los Angeles in May of '91, while Nevermind was being mixed, Rape Me is an anti-rape song sung from the perspective of the victim. It's like she's saying, "Rape me, go ahead, rape me, beat me. You'll never kill me. I'll survive this and I'm gonna rape you one of these days and you won't even know it," Kurt told Darcy Steink of Spin in October of '93. Although some have suggested the song was written in response to the media's outlook on his personal life, Cobain's success in public battle with drugs emerged months after. In December of 1993, Rape Me was released as a double A side with All Apologies in the UK, where it reached number 32. Not long after, Kurt agreed to let his record company list the song as Waif Me on copies of In Utero sold in the Walmart and Kmart retail chains. As the fifth song on In Utero suggests, Kurt was well aware that he was becoming harder and harder for his management, his record label, and even his bandmates to deal with. With this track, he effectively describes himself as the Frances Farmer of alternative rock music. Like Kurt, Frances Farmer had her demons. She was a movie star in the late 1930s and 40s, but fell from grace and spiraled into alcoholism. Arrested for drinking and driving, the actress was released, but subsequently sent to a mental hospital after she violated her parole by traveling to Mexico. After being institutionalized, she was given shock treatments and ultimately a lobotomy. As Kurt learned when he read the 1978 novel Shadowland, a fictionalized account of Farmer's life by William Arnold, the Seattle native was actually given another shot at stardom and wound up having her own television show in the 1950s, before alcoholism and ultimately cancer led to her death in 1970. The parallels between the actress and the rocker are remarkable. Both were strong-willed and rebellious, defiant for the sake of their art. Over time, Dumb, one of Nirvana's most accessible songs, has become a favorite on American alternative radio. Kurt once suggested the song was informed by the marijuana he regularly smoked as a teenager. In his unused liner notes about the song, he would blame pot for affecting his memory, damaging his nerves, strengthening his destructive tendencies, and prompting him to seek out stronger drugs like heroin, hence the line that refers to floating around and hanging out on clouds before succumbing to the hangover. Despite this explanation, when Kurt spoke to Melody Maker about the song in August of '92, he claimed that the track was about people who were easily amused and television fed. Not unlike the many people he knew in Montesano and Aberdeen, these dumb people had crummy, mundane jobs yet somehow seemed happy. The aggressive approach of Very Ape is fitting considering its lyrical slant, which seems to take aim at the macho mentality that exists inside many men. With its overdriven guitar lines, pulverizing rhythms, and lack of melody, the song depicts the inconsistent character who, At first, comes off as very nice and respectful to women before revealing a dark side. A strong indication to fans that Kurt was still lovesick and drowning in drug addiction, Milk It finds Nirvana's frontman singing of being his own parasite, while smelling the scent of Courtney on his clothes while in recovery. Lyrical themes aside, the song is a showcase for Grohl's drumming abilities and ranks among one of his most inventive performances with the band. In part a lyrical collaboration with Love, Pennyroyal Tea finds Kurt confessing to having very bad posture while also singing about living life on his own schedule and taking warm milk and laxatives, as a means to fight his opioid-driven constipation. It has also been suggested that the song's title was an intentionally self-depreciating play on the phrase Pennyroyal Tea. However, in '93, Kurt told Impact that the song was about someone suffering from deep despair, without fully admitting it was autobiographical. The song is about a person who's beyond depressed, he explained. They're in their deathbed, pretty much. Cobain did concede that his own stomach pain was informed in the song. He went on to explain his line about a Leonard Cohen afterworld, saying that along with Samuel Beckett's novel Malloy, Cohen's records were his, quote, therapy when he was depressed and sick. The music for the song dates back to the fall of 1990, when Kurt and Grohl worked on it on a 4-track when they were living together in Olympia. Kurt claimed to Michael Azerrad that he wrote the music in about 30 seconds. Although Nirvana had planned to release the song as a UK single in April of '94, the unexpected end of the band prompted its cancellation. German copies of the CD single did hit the market, but they were recalled and destroyed. Just the same, the song remains a fan favorite. In 2004, NME ranked it as number 8 among the top 20 Nirvana songs of all time. Call it an antidote to the slick, radio-ready Nirvana heard on Teen Spirit, this guitar-driven feedback-laden track was originally titled 4-Month Media Blackout, in response to the massive reception the former song was given between October of '91 to January of '92. The term radio-friendly refers to a song with commercial appeal, while a unit shifter is a song that helps sell albums. Yet Kurt was being intentionally ironic, as this was perhaps one of the most discordant numbers on the record. The lyrics were somewhat of an afterthought, with Kurt even deeming it a throwaway song and indicating that he had written the various lines separately before linking them together. At just 92 seconds, this sonic eruption is aptly named, as it included the musical equivalent of a Tourette sufferer's outburst. Nirvana's furious but memorable performance is driven by Grohl's drum assault, Novoselic's hypnotic bass, and Cobain's roaring guitar and cathartic vocals. Originally titled La 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 La, the idea for Nirvana's third Billboard Modern Rock #1 first surfaced in 1990, and the song was initially recorded during the studio demo sessions with Craig Montgomery in Seattle on January 1st, '91. The trio's first attempt at the music took place in acoustic form, with Novoselic playing a second guitar in lieu of his bass while Grohl augmented his drumming with a tambourine. A full electric version of the song was eventually tracked with Steve Albini on February 14, '93, and featured the cello work of guest player Kara Shaley, the only outside musician to play on Nirvana's third studio disc. When it came time for Cobain to deliver his vocals, he had decided to title the track All Apologies, and dedicate it to his wife and daughter. Although he insisted it wasn't actually about his family, Kurt would convey to Michael Azerrad that the upbeat and peaceful tone of the recording, one of the more accessible numbers on In Utero, and his lyrics about being at ease in the sunshine made it a good choice to honor his loved ones. All the same, the song wasn't entirely positive. Kurt's uncertain and unhappy outlook is hard to ignore. Based on his prose, the guilt and sadness he felt about the kind of drug-addled husband and father he had become was impossible to ignore.
Hey guys, now I'm going to share with you more of that interview where Dave Grohl, Chris Novoselic, and Butch Vig discuss the making of Nevermind. Chris and Dave talk about why they hired Butch Vig in the first place, how Kurt, Chris, and Dave would drive around every night listening to their daily rough mixes, and more, including a funny story of how a drunk Chris Novoselic pranked Lenny Kravitz during the Nevermind sessions. Lenny was in the same studio as Nirvana. Quick note, Nirvana recorded a boombox demo of Teen Spirit before they did the final version with Butch. That boombox recording is the Teen Spirit demo Dave refers to in this interview.
Before we made Nevermind with Butch, Nirvana had recorded 6 or 7 songs with Butch at Smart Studios. And then when we signed the contract with Geffen, we were talking about a producer for the record, and we talked about a few different people, David Briggs, Don Dixon, I can't remember who else. But we went with Butch because they had worked with him before and they had a good relationship with him, you know. It's the same reason why the Foo Fighters made a new record with Butch, is because I've worked with them before, and it's a strange dynamic when you have a band of people that have a creative relationship. Just to invite someone in to that creative dynamic, it has to be someone that you feel comfortable with personally and creatively, and you have to have some sort of trust, you know. So I always thought of it like Butch started a studio in Madison, Wisconsin a long time ago, and he was the punk rock producer in town, right? So the punk rock bands would come to Butch, and usually punk rock bands didn't really sound great. You know, the drummers were shitty, or the singers couldn't sing, or they had bad equipment. And so, but it was Butch's job to make them sound great, you know. So with very little time and with very little resources, he would make these bands sound better. And so making Nevermind, all Butch really had to do was to kind of, I don't know, rein us in to make it sound like a bigger version of our band, because like that version of Smells Like Teen Spirit, that was the only version of Smells Like Teen Spirit we had heard until we recorded with Butch.
Right.
So when we did that first take and we listened to it back over the speakers, it was like, shit, there's a big difference, you know? There's a big difference between that boombox. It's the same band, it's basically the same performance, but you introduce Butch Vig into the equation, and that's what happened.
Butch isn't like some couch guy who just kind of like has these ideas, and there's an engineer who does all the mixing, all these concepts or whatever. Like Butch is really like hands-on, and he was really professional. Like, you know, we'd show up at like 1 or 2 o'clock. Butch had already been there for a couple hours, and he'd stay a couple hours after we left, putting things together.
Did you guys listen to that new version, that big version? And was there a moment, Chris, where you and Dave and Kurt sat back and went, "Hey man, we're a punk band. I don't know. This is big sound."
We came over to the studio, and Butch is like, "Check this out." And so he put up the 2-inch tape of it on the big speakers and just cranked it really loud. And I'm just like, wow, yeah, that sounds really cool.
Initially, after Nevermind came out, there was some press. People were saying it was overproduced or too slick sounding. It's so simple. Dave, you said that earlier. I think it was 24 track. I think on the 24 track, there's maybe like 15 tracks that we used.
Right.
It's minimal drums, bass, 1 or 2 guitars, Dave singing, or Chris singing, or Kurt singing, excuse me, and then Dave singing harmonies here and there. But if you look across the track sheets, it's dead simple. It was more for me about just getting the microphones right, getting the right guitar tone. I had Kurt switch amps a lot. We tried a lot of different amps and microphones. I'd tinker with your bass sound. I'd help Dave tune the drums. But it was just really the three of us. There was an assistant engineer there. It wasn't any sort of magic or weirdness. It was just trying to get the stuff to sound really good. And a lot of it helped that they were really playing really, really good.
I remember listening to it back. We would take the rough mixes every night, and we'd get a cassette, and Kurt and Chris and I would jump in our, what was it, like a Volkswagen Rabbit or something like that? Is that what it was?
It was a Volkswagen van.
It was a van, and we would drive around the hills and listen to the mixes. And, you know, but I never thought, stop. This is too awesome.
No, Dave,
that never crossed my mind.
I can't believe how good we are.
We were talking about this last week. You said you were starting to sweat, like you would go home and listen. I don't know, is the drumming good enough?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was too, like, you know, first of all, I was the 5th drummer of Nirvana. So that's like, it's almost like being married to one of those people whose other husbands have disappeared, you know? So I just wanted to play good, you know, and I would go home and listen to it. You know, nowadays, if you record in a studio with a famous producer, you'll use Pro Tools digital technology, and they'll grid you and line you up so that you're absolutely perfect on every beat, you know. But it wasn't that way. And I would listen, and I heard a lot of inconsistencies that I worried, like, oh no, I'm going to get fucking fired because I'm not playing good
We
enough.
did punch-ins on the bass. Like a punch-in is like now on a computer you can just click and drag things, but back then it's like the tape's going and then Butch would punch me in and I would play it and then punch it out. So that's how you kind of fix things.
There was, I mean, you know, coming from the punk rock scene, even in that studio, which we considered sort of a little dumpy, it was like a real studio. That was the nicest place I'd ever recorded, you know. The place we recorded the record was a studio called Sound City in Van Nuys, California, in the valley outside of Hollywood and all that stuff. And so it was kind of this rundown, dumpy old studio in a warehouse complex away from any of the glamour or glitz of LA and Hollywood. So it was basically, there was one big room That was Studio A, and it was this great drum room that was, I don't know, it was kind of the size of a racquetball court or something, right? Like a small gym.
Like a basketball gym, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't play racquetball.
Yeah, Chris didn't play racquetball. And then there was a small control room. So the way we did it is we had the drums in the drum room, and Chris and Kurt and I were in the same room together, I think, and we would just record live.
Yeah, we set up basically some headphones, so Dave was right in the center of the room, and Chris and Kurt were about 5 or 6 feet away, but their amps were set in little closets, little ISO booths. Kurt's amp was there's a tiny little passageway between the studio and the control room, and basically they were standing about 5 feet apart. We tracked everything live. It was kind of the sense of the sound of the record that we wanted to get. And I didn't know when we went down to start the album, but they had been rehearsing for 3 months solid every single day, like 10 hours a day. That's all they did. Chris and Dave said that the reason they loved to go to rehearsal is because the apartment they had was so shitty and so cold. They couldn't wait to get out of there. And so basically lived in that rehearsal room. And when we came down to track Nevermind, they were whip tight. I mean, super, super tight. You know, I was kind of freaked out. I'd been making all these punk rock records in Madison, Wisconsin. It was my first major label gig going to LA and doing Nirvana for Geffen, and I was like, okay, is there something I should be doing? Like, what do producers who are major labels do? Like, should I have like extra people around me or whatever? I didn't really know. You know?
Butch started wearing a beret. What are you doing?
Calling the engineer.
Where'd you get the beret?
I didn't know. And, you know, as soon as I got there, it was basically everybody left us alone. I mean, we went in and made the record on our own. There was no really interference.
That was my favorite part when we were making the record. Nobody from the record company came down to hear what we were doing. I'm like, I called our manager, John Silva. I'm like, should we be worried that no one's come down to listen to anything? And John Silva, he goes, you should feel blessed. I was like, oh, okay, cool.
For the label, we waited for Gary for like hours.
Oh, yeah. A little sidebar, one of the anomalies on the record, at one point we were waiting for someone from the label to come down, from Geffen, to hear. No, it was in pre-pro. It was right before we went in to record the first day. And we went in at noon, being the boys were on time, I was on time, and we rehearsed for like 3 or 4 hours. No one showed up. I made a call. There were no cell phones back then. You had to go to the office or to a payphone. And we're not sure where they'll be down there soon, 5 or 6. It went hours.
Smoke signals.
At some point, Chris and I went, well, screw this. Let's go to the liquor store. We got like a case of beer and a bottle of Jack Daniels, and we started plowing through it. And next door to the studio, Lenny Kravitz was rehearsing. And at 6 o'clock, the management left. And all of a sudden, I'm in talking to Kurt and Dave, and I hear this, would Lenny Kravitz please come to the office right now? Chris had gone down, broke into the office and grabbed the microphone. And it stunned volume. And there's like 6 or 8 rehearsal rooms all over the building. Would Lenny Kravitz please come down to the office now?
I mean, I love Lenny Kravitz, but I wanted to meet him.
I remember.
Seriously.
I freaked out, John. I ran down the hallway. Oh, my God, where's Chris? I didn't even know where the office was. It's this big building. I'm looking down these halls, and I hear his voice booming over the PA. Where the hell is Chris? Needless to say, we left before the record company even showed up. We were like, okay, it's time to get out of here now.
There was this liquor store that we always went to. It was called Circus Liquor. And they had this huge neon sign that was this evil clown.
Its eyes were little X's.
Yeah. And they sold T-shirts for $2.
Hey, man.
So it was just like a T-shirt that said Circus Liquor with, we called him Alky the Clown.
Alky the Clown. Not to glorify the, alcohol,
of course not.
I think, but
drink responsibly for all the people actually are watching out there.
Stay in school.
That's how the clown's eyes got crossed.
In rock bands, you have all this downtime, and you get bored, and you wait an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Oh, let's go to the store. And what do? You buy beer,
I was such a stupid kid. And now I'm a stupid adult.
Don't be so hard on yourself. Come on.
But I think when we made Nevermind, I was 21 or 22. We were kind of naive, and we didn't really know too much when we were making this record. I remember thinking, we signed to a big record company, and we're making this serious record in this big, serious Los Angeles studio. And we got down there, and it didn't seem like a big, serious
the place was kind of a dump.
It was kind of a dump.
The place was kind of a dump,
and they were about to close. I think they were sort of on their last legs.
We got a deal there. I think it was $600 a day for studio time, pretty cheap.
The place we recorded the record was a studio called Sound City in Van Nuys, California, in the valley outside of Hollywood and all that stuff. And so it was kind of this rundown, dumpy old studio in a warehouse complex away from any of the glamour or glitz of LA and Hollywood. So it was basically, there was one big room that was Studio A, and it was this great drum room that was, I don't know, it was kind of the size of a racquetball court or something, right? Like a small gym.
Like a basketball gym, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't play racquetball.
Yeah, Chris didn't play racquetball. And then there was a small control room. So the way we did it is we had the drums in the drum room, and Chris and Kurt and I were in the same room together, I think, and we would just record live.
Yeah, we set up basically some headphones, so Dave was right in the center of the room, and Chris and Kurt were about 5 or 6 feet away, but their amps were set in little closets, little ISO booths. Kurt's amp was there's a tiny little passageway between the studio and the control room, and basically they were standing about 5 feet apart. We tracked everything live. It was kind of the sense of the sound of the record that we wanted to get. And I didn't know when we went down to start the album, but they had been rehearsing for 3 months solid every single day, like 10 hours a day. That's all they did. Chris and Dave said that the reason they loved to go to rehearsal is because the apartment they had was so shitty and so cold. They couldn't wait to get out of there. And so basically lived in that rehearsal room. And when we came down to track Nevermind, they were whip tight. I mean, super, super tight.
I actually just saw in the reissue thing, there's a booklet that comes with it. It has all this paperwork from the original session. And I was looking at the budget for the album. It's all typed out. I just now found out that when we were making that record, Butch was staying at the $90 hotel, and we were staying at the $70 hotel. So that's where all the money went.
70 divided by 3.
There was, coming from the punk rock scene, even in that studio, which we considered sort of a little dumpy, it was like a real studio. That was the nicest place I'd ever recorded,
Here, Dave reflects on meeting Kurt for the first time. Dave joined Nirvana in the summer of 1990. The first time he met Chris and Kurt was at the airport near Seattle.
He showed up at the airport with a drum set. He brought a whole drum set on the plane, so we went to baggage claim, oversized luggage, and there's a drum set. And we loaded it up, and like the next day, we went to rehearsal, and we started to play every day after that.
It was funny, too, because one of the first things that I really remember is I had this apple that I brought. I think I got it on the plane or something like that. These two picked me up, and we get into the van, and I have this apple, and I say to Kurt, "Hey, you want a bite of my apple?" And he goes, "No, man, those things make my teeth bleed." I'll never forget that. I don't know.
Is it harder to join a band, or is it harder to leave a band? You guys were together, and Dave walks in, and he's joining you guys, but he's also leaving another band. What was harder for you and Chris?
Well, I remember calling you on the phone, and I think it was Pete, answered the phone, and I'm like, "Is Dave there?" And he's like, "Yeah." Like he knew. Yeah.
Well, it was tough because coming from Scream, those were guys that I'd been in a band with for years and years, and we had struggled and played in clubs and starved and, done the whole punk rock thing, but we were stuck, and the band was just sort of shut down.
I remember calling you. It was because Skeeter, the bass player, quit in L.A., so you're stuck in North Hollywood, and you told me that the landlord took the front door off the house because the rent was
he wanted to evict us, so he just took the front door.
He took the front door off the house. So Dave had to get out of there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, and honestly, it was my mother that gave me this advice where I said, "Mom, I don't know what to do. I don't want to leave Pete and Franz. They're like family, but I'm getting asked to join this band up in Seattle, and I've got nothing. What do I do?" And she's like, "Sometimes you just got to do what's best for yourself,
So you decided to go to school. To community college.
Yeah. No. Trade school.
You could have fixed the door if you'd known a little bit.
I could have fixed the door.
Here, Dave talks more about his mother and his early days in Nirvana.
My mom was a public school teacher for 35 years. She was that teacher in school that looked at each kid as an individual, and no two kids learn the same, So you could be teaching one subject to 40 different people, and you might have to do it 40 different ways. So she understood kids, I dropped out of high school to play music, and I think she understood the passion that I had for playing music, I didn't take lessons to play drums. I learned how to do it on my bed. And so I would put on punk rock records like Minor Threat records or Bad Brains records, and I would sit there and play on pillows until there was like sweat dripping down the fucking windows in my bedroom, you know? And she saw that and she understood, like, okay, he should probably focus on the one thing that he's passionate about rather than be stuck under a bunch of fluorescent lights for, 9 hours a day. So she let me go. She was like, okay, you better be pretty good. So, and then, I paid for the house and all that shit. It turned out okay. Honestly, when I heard that they needed a drummer, I immediately went and bought Bleach, which I'd heard before and I liked, but I didn't have the whole record. I just taped a couple songs off of it, So I went and I just learned the record from front to back. I mean, honestly, I knew I was capable of doing it. I think it was just more a matter of chemistry, just to see if we really played well together. The first time we set up and jammed, we just blazed through songs, and I sang backup vocals too, which I don't think anyone had done yet, and Kurt was into that. And when it's a three-piece, I'd been in a three-piece before, a couple bands before that when I was a teenager, and there's something about being in a three-piece. It's different than being in a four-piece or a five-piece. It's a really powerful thing because it's a band stripped down to pretty much its basic elements. And Chris and I were a badass rhythm section, and Kurt was an amazing songwriter, had a great voice. So when we set up in a room, like a 10 by 10 room, it just sounded like Nirvana. It was super simple. We blazed through those songs, and I don't know if I really felt like, I hope I got the job. I just felt like, well, that sounded pretty good,
Here, Dave shares a funny story about how he wanted the band to destroy his drum set. Kurt would always smash equipment on stage, including Dave's equipment. And so at one point in the Nevermind tour in late 1991, Dave decided, you know what, let's just fully destroy the drum set so I can get a new one. But did that plan actually work out? Well, let's see what Dave says.
Kurt, equipment would get smashed up, guitars would get smashed up, and he would chop at my drum set. These two would throw their guitars at me at the end of the show, and so my drum set just looked like Swiss cheese. It had holes in it, and it was so busted up that I kept asking our tour manager if maybe I could get a new drum set. And Monty Lee Wilkes, and he kept saying, just could you hold out one more week? I said, yeah, hold out one more week. So finally when we got to Chicago on that Nevermind tour, I thought, okay, tonight I'm just going to splinter my drum set so that I have to get a new one. So I told Kurt before the show, I said, dude, at the end of the gig, let's make sure that we break it so that there's nothing left so that I can get a new set. Kurt's like, okay. So at the end of the gig, we spent a good 20 minutes. Drums are hard to break too.
Yeah, man. They're made well.
They're made well, and they bounce, and you try to crush them.
We were in the van, and we went by a music store and said, all drums, 40% off. And Dave's like,
tonight's the night.
Yeah,
but
we're going to go ahead and buy a new drum set.
For whatever reason, the next day, I couldn't get a fucking drum set. So we were on tour with Urge Overkill, and I had to use Blackie, the drummer of Urge Overkill.
Blackie Onassis.
Yeah, I had to use his drums for a while. But then, the best part was 2 nights later, I'm using his drum set, and we're playing this place in St. Louis called Mississippi Nights. And the bouncers were being fucking assholes, and they were not cool to the kids. And so most of these places we were playing were just packed to the gills. Kids were stage diving, and it looked like riots, And so if you had never been to a show like that,
Guns N' Roses had a riot at
theirs. They just had a riot there a couple weeks before. And so if you'd never seen that before, then you just think that it was out of control and it wasn't cool. So these security guys weren't being fucking cool, and Kurt kept saying, he kept trying to get them to cool out, and they wouldn't cool out. So finally Kurt said, everybody up on stage. And it turned into this crazy mini riot where all these kids jumped up on stage, and I got freaked out. So I ran back into Urge Overkill's dressing room, and I was like, you guys, there's a fucking riot out there. And Blackie was like, that's cool. Where's my fucking drum set?
I made that speech about anarchy.
I remember.
Yeah.
You cooled it out.
Yeah. It was a lecture on anarchy. And about anarchy is important, but it requires responsibility. Yeah, the only way anarchy is going to work is if we all accept responsibility. Yeah, so.
That show in Chicago took place on October 12th of 1991. A few weeks later, Nirvana played one of their most famous shows ever at the Paramount Theater in Seattle. It took place on October 31st, 1991. It was another one of those instances where the band really started to understand how big and famous they were getting off of Nevermind. This was Nirvana's first performance in Seattle since the album came out. It was basically their homecoming.
That show originally, I think, was supposed to be at the Moore Theater. And that was one of the indications that stuff was starting to change. There's a couple theaters downtown in Seattle. One is the Moore Theater that holds maybe like 1,000 people. And then there's the Paramount that holds like 3,000 people. And the venue got upgraded. And I remember hearing that they moved it to the Paramount. And I thought, wow, that's a trip. That was the biggest show of the tour, I think.
It was like a homecoming show, so there was a lot of people there. Like my mom showed up with Rose, and they got their hair done because it was a big deal. Yeah,
it was and I remember after that we had one day off, and then we had to go to Europe. So, but honestly, when I think about that time, I just remember being skinny.
Yeah, you are a fat piece of shit now. I'm looking at you.
No, but I mean, like, it was like that was at that time. Kurt and I always had this thing where we were so dangerously thin that we thought that we could make ourselves look normal by drinking protein shakes. Do you remember that? And Kurt bought that weird little thing to mix the protein shakes in like a cup that had a little, you'd like push on it, it would spin this thing inside. And
1-800 shake or something. Like it was like off the late night TV.
It never worked.
What did you said your mom came down, a bunch of kids from this smaller town in Washington, and you decide you're going to head off on your own and join the punk scene. And, this is the first time. How do your families react, and did it change your dynamic with them?
Well, everybody was really happy and really proud. Yeah, it was success. Like, wow. So, some people want to borrow money.
That comes quick, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But as a parent,
yeah,
it's hard. Imagine if your kid said, "Dad, I'm really sorry. I'm not into high school. I'm going to split and jump in a van with 5 sweaty guys and for the next 6 months."
Remember what my dad said?
What did he say?
He got mad at us because we were playing in the garage. It was way early on. He's like, "You should trade in those guitars for shovels."
That's right.
Right. He wasn't.
But then once you become successful in some way, he
was all over it.
Well, in your parents' eyes, they start to feel like okay, you're cool now,
right?
You have a legitimate career or something like that.
Yeah, they forget the shit they gave you going in. He probably came to you and said, "Remember that time I told you to trade in those shovels for guitars?" That was something, right?
I was just kidding.
Yeah.
My mom bought me my first guitar. So.
Oh, that's nice. Did you start out guitar, drums?
I started out with guitar too. My mom bought me my first guitar too.
I know. I ended up on bass.
I ended up with drums.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And back on
good parents
guitar.
let good things happen like that, I think.
Right. That was a different aesthetic back then too. The parents had I thought back then parents were more about like you do something safe, you just kind of stick with it. I think for them to let you go and go off on that was a little harder for that generation. It was just a different mindset.
That's been one of my lectures lately. It's like, when I was 21 years old, I had a job, I was in a band, I had my own apartment.
You were a responsible bass player.
I was a responsible bass player, yeah.